Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I am one of your two co-hosts for today, John DeLynn. It is June 20th, 2022, and I'm here in studio with Jen Camp. Hey, Jen.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks for joining us.
Of course.
Yeah, it's good to have you, Jen.
Thanks.
And we are here for what I think is going to be one of the most important interviews of the year, and maybe it'll go down as one of the most important interviews that I do. We are here today to interview Melissa and Sam. This is Sam Zitting Wyson and Melissa Zitting Wyson, who went by Melissa, I guess, Cowles.
Yep.
Before you married Sam. Is that right?
Yes.
And they are the co-hosts of a really exciting and up-and-coming YouTube channel called Growing Up Polygamy, which has at least 20,000 subscribers. Yeah. And my personal inbox has been inundated over the past month or two with requests to interview them because they have such a devoted, loyal following who wants to hear their full story from start to finish. And that has been happening. And with the, not just the Under the Banner of Heaven, series that came out on Hulu, but recently a new series has come out on Netflix called Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey, I think it's called, which is talking about the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the FLDS Church, that is still, I guess, currently led by Warren Jeffs. It's an offshoot of the most well-known LDS church that up until recently was primarily located in Colorado City or Short Creek, which is either in southern Utah or northern Arizona or somewhere in Colorado. I forget exactly what the borders are of that group. And of course, at some point they moved to El Dorado. And of course, at some point, Warren Jeffs was put in jail for, I guess it was an accomplice to rape of a minor, but we're going to get into all that. But this Netflix series, both Gerardo, my colleague, got into it, and then Jen Camp also really got into it. Jen cares a lot about this issue. It's personal to her as well. And both Gerardo and Jen are like, John, we really need to cover fundamentalist polygamy more on Mormon Stories. I'll just say we have covered it a tiny bit. My very first video I ever did, I'll just say this for history's sake, I interviewed a woman named Ann Wild, who, that was the first video I ever tried to do. I did it on my own, and she was a polygamist, and she was proud of it. She was raised LDS, married an LDS man, and then divorced him, and then married Ogden Kraut, who was like a really well-known fundamentalist polygamist and author in the 60s and 70s that got under Bruce R. McConkey's skin quite a bit. Anyway, we'll include a link to the Ann Wild, it's W-I-L-D-E, Ann Wild interview. I've also interviewed Vance Allred and Lance Allred from the Allred group. So Vance Allred recently passed away. He was a really well-loved historian, school teacher of history here in Salt Lake. He was the son of Rulon Allred, who led the Allred group for many years. And then his son, Lance Allred, was the first deaf NBA player in the National Basketball Association. And he played with LeBron James for the Cleveland Cavaliers. So those are at least a couple, let's just say three. And I've interviewed Lance twice, one for his story and then once for a book that he came out about toxic masculinity recently. Anyway, that's a little bit of what we've covered so far in Mormon Stories. There may be a couple other instances. Of course, we did a recent series with Sandra Tanner about polygamy. I entered Todd Compton very early on. We can include a link to that. Todd Compton is the author of a really important book called In Sacred Loneliness. So that was one of the first, I would say, 30 interviews that I did on Mormon Stories, was interviewing Todd Compton. And then, of course, we've interviewed Lindsay Hansen Park, where she talked about her year of polygamy episode. So we've tried to cover polygamy a little bit over the years, but never like today with all the time that we have and really good audio and video, and never with a couple that are so awesome.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. And I'll add, we're going to be doing this episode, and then we're also going to be doing a panel later this week with you guys, with Jen and Gerardo, I think is the plan for now. Maybe someone else as well. But we would really love to do a long form interview with a woman who grew up in the FLDS church. And so I'm going to put that call out there as well. And I just kind of want to state some intentions up front. So anyway, that's just a little bit of background. But today, and if everybody's saying, wow, this is the longest intro ever, I'm just going to say we do long form on Mormon Stories podcast because these issues are important. The people care about the information. We don't want sound bites and highly edited stuff. We like to take time. So that's why we're doing this. So I guess I'm not going to apologize for the intro. But I will say that I'll just tell everyone how we plan to do today. We plan to begin by doing part 1, which will be Sam's experience growing up in the FLDS church up through when things started to go wrong. So up through about age 16 or so. That's going to be part 1 of this episode. We can't do 8-hour episodes. So we're going to do that as part 1. Part 2 is going to be once things started falling apart with Sam's experience with the FLDS church, what led to him, and I'm going to give away a little bit of the ending, what led to him converting to the traditional mainstream LDS church, which included meeting Elder Jeffrey R. Holland and serving a full-time mission for the church, kind of going from FLDS to a full-time Mormon missionary within a year, I believe. And then eventually, him meeting Melissa and marrying her, and sort of trying to do the traditional LDS church route. That's going to be part 2. And then part 3, we'll talk about where their faith journeys have led them today, if they have had any struggles with their Orthodox LDS faith. We'll talk about that. And we'll talk about what's led them to start their own channel. And we'll probably just do some Q&A about, Joseph Smith and Warren Jeffs and the similarities and differences, and the LDS church and the FLDS church and the similarities and differences. We'll be doing that in our panel as well. But in part 3, we may have a bit more of a free-formed discussion. So that's our intention for today. Buckle up. Relax, get a tea or a coffee or a Diet Coke or a water, whatever your beverage of choice is. We're just super excited. Jen, is there anything I left off that you want to add?
No, that's great. I'm excited.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, and I guess I should say, Sam and Melissa, is there anything you would want to add to that introduction before we jump in?
No, sounds great. And that, I think that's a great way to go about it. So we're excited to get into it.
Okay.
Good.
All right. And I'll give one last, maybe tiny bit of disclaimer. Normally, when we interview a couple, we want to make sure and give both people full time for their full stories. And especially since we come from a patriarchy, if we err on the side of giving the woman even more time than the man. In this case, because we're kind of spotlighting the FLDS church, we are going to hear Melissa's story, but they flew in this morning and they're going to fly out this evening. And so we have to manage time a little bit. And so we're going to definitely hear about Melissa's story, but we might not be giving Melissa as quite the level of emphasis, frankly, that she deserves, just because of time constraints. And so, but we are definitely inviting Melissa to jump in and share all the way along, and we will be doing her story again, just not with the level of depth that you deserve.
No worries. It sounds great.
Okay. All right. So without any further ado, let's begin. Normally I say, let's begin with your Mormon story, but I'm guessing, Sam, you didn't identify as a Mormon growing up. So
No, not really. We did not. So, I mean, we understood the similarities, but it was never, we didn't consider ourselves Mormon. You're correct.
Yeah. So where does your FLDS story begin? And if you want to talk about your ancestors, I don't know when your family might have joined the movement. Yes. But if you want to mention that, I want to hear about your parents and even your grandparents or ancestors, if that's relevant at all.
So both of my parents were raised in the FLDS church. And so it's, I guess I have a long line of people in the FLDS church, but my great-great-grandfather was the first one to join. And he actually came over from Sweden, directly from Sweden with the early saints to Utah. So he was converted from Sweden, came to Utah with the saints, and that's kind of where our first introduction to the mainstream LDS church was.
Any idea about when that was?
Oh man,
a decade or century?
Oh man, I'm trying to remember the exact date. I did look it up. I don't remember off the top of my head though.
That's fine.
So, but anyway, so he came across with the saints and joined the church at that point. I'm not exactly too sure on his exact conversion story, so that's something that I would have to dive into a little bit more, and is something that I'm more interested in now. So I will be looking into that.
Sure.
But anyway, so that was the first introduction, and for the first long while, we were, as far as my ancestors, they were all just a part of the mainstream known as Mormon church. That's kind of where the background started and came from.
And you're kind of your last name was Zitting.
Yes.
And your mom's maiden name?
Beagley.
Beagley.
Her last name is Beagley,
So you come from Zittings and Beagleys.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. So
mainstream Mormons.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay.
A lot of England and Sweden and Scotland, those areas is kind of where my ancestors are all from.
Western Europe and Scandinavia.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah. So, and then as time went on, I'm sure a lot of people know about the manifesto and Wilford Woodruff signing that. So that's kind of where things split off.
If it's okay, can I we have a lot of never Mormons who listen. Half our audience has never been Mormon.
Yes.
So I'll explain that super briefly. Is that okay?
Definitely.
Okay. So Joseph Smith secretly practiced polygamy and lied about it up until his death. So basically 1841, 1844, secretly practicing it, lying to them about it, hiding it from most of the members, had over 30 wives, was killed for trying to cover up, was basically put in jail for trying to cover up people who were outing him for his polygamy by printing, a newspaper printing press called the Nauvoo Expositor. He had it destroyed because it was going to out him as having lied about practicing polygamy. He was put in jail, and then he was killed while he was in jail. And the Mormon Church didn't want to admit the polygamy for many, many years. Even when they moved to Utah and were still practicing it, they kind of wanted to keep it under wraps until I think the mid-1850s. Brigham Young finally came out and admitted it. But even when the Mormon Church was sending missionaries to the British Isles to convert women to polygamy, to bring them to the States to become polygamous wives, they were telling the Europeans that they weren't practicing polygamy. And to the world, they were still denying it up until they just couldn't deny it anymore. But then from like the 1850s to the 1890s, for about 40 years, they were openly practicing polygamy. But then the United States government started really going after them because it was illegal. Yep. And so they started putting our leaders in jail, arresting them, and seizing our property. And basically the church was going to cease to be if they didn't abandon the polygamy.
Right.
And so Brigham Young, John Taylor, and Wilford Woodruff all were polygamists. Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, John Taylor.
And Wilford Woodruff.
Wilford Woodruff, yeah. But in 1890, the church told everyone publicly that they were going to stop practicing polygamy. And that's the manifesto that you're talking about that Wilford Woodruff issued. However, the mainstream Orthodox LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, continued secretly practicing polygamy for at least another 15 to 20 years after that. But the 1890 is this manifesto the LDS Church put out to tell the world they were going to stop. And lied about that too. And we're not trying to criticize the church. That's just a fact. So that's the 1890 manifesto. that Wilford Woodruff put out. Now your family back in.
Yes, and you're correct. Actually, for a long time, a lot of the leaders that started the FLDS church remained in good terms with the church and Wilford Woodruff, because they already had several wives. And for a time there, the leaders of the church, like Wilford Woodruff, he as well had several wives. So for those that continued on with polygamy, they said that was okay, but no one else was allowed to get more wives at that point.
Yeah.
And then it was a later leader. It was after Wilford Woodruff, I believe the prophet after him, or maybe two down the line.
So there's Wilford Woodruff, then Lorenzo Snow, then Joseph F. Smith, and Heber J. Grant. I think they were all polygamists. I think David O. McKay was the first Mormon prophet that wasn't a polygamist, I think.
Yes, I believe it was Joseph F. Smith that actually finally stood up and said, okay, we are having nothing else to do with polygamy, because if we continue this on, the government will shut us down. And so that, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that's kind of the leader that stood up and said, okay, no more. And that's where the FLDS originally said, just came out and said, okay, we're no longer going to be associated with the mainstream church. We're starting our own thing, because the leaders like Wilford Woodruff, Brigham Young, all of these leaders told us that polygamy was necessary to return to God.
And we should have our own episode about the rumors that John Taylor, I think, received a revelation that polygamy was supposed to continue, but that it needed to continue separate from the mainstream church, and that had John Taylor's blessing and even potentially the Lord's blessing.
Exactly. Yeah. And I have heard of that. So it was because of these prophets that came out and said, this is necessary to return to the celestial kingdom and live in the presence of God. So a lot of the leaders, my grandfather being one of them, said, okay, we have to continue on. There's no way that God would change his mind like this and all of a sudden say, never mind, this isn't important. And so my grandfather was very, very, Charles Zitting was a very big part of this, and he was thrown into prison for quite some time as well.
Really?
Yes, he was.
In the mid-1900s?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yep, and my father actually...
Because there were raids, right? The government did some raids.
There were, yes.
Do you want to give a little bit of history on that? Because I didn't know your family was involved in that.
Yes, well, that was a long time ago. So my father was a very young boy during these raids, and at the time, I believe the prophet was Roy Johnson. He went by Uncle Warren to those that were members of the FLDS church. I'm sorry, Uncle Roy. Yes, Uncle Roy. And so law enforcement showed up many, many years ago. This happened more than once. And
where would this have been? What town? Or
so this was on the border of Utah and Arizona, in Colorado City and Hilldale.
Okay.
Or otherwise known as Short Creek.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the law enforcement showed up. They split up the families. They took the women and children and kind of scattered them throughout Arizona. And after Roy Johnson and the other leaders of the church were released from prison, they actually went out and drove throughout the state and gathered up all of the children and women and brought them all back.
Do you have any family stories about your grandfather being involved in this?
There are some stories, it was one of those things where even my father, he's at an advanced age now, he was a very young boy. And so it was one of those things that it was something that I heard from him because he was such a young boy as well. I don't know that, or know too many very specifics, I guess.
And what was tricky about those raids, as I understand it, was that the government didn't really think it through, because they're incarcerating all these fathers, but then all the wives and children have no one to feed them. And so they're literally starving. And they realized, do we really want to cause a bunch of women and children to starve?
Right.
And that's why, if I understand it, that's why they had to let the men go. And then prosecuting for polygamy became a problem after that the 1950s forward.
It did, and it's been very difficult for anyone to prosecute for polygamy because of some of the issues that they had in the past.
Well, and they didn't really want to have people in jail for polygamy. Like, these men were good men, and his grandfather's journals, he talks about the fact he was one of the men, he's like in jail and had written down his life story, and we're lucky to have that. And he mentions the fact that, they basically came and said, hey, we don't want to keep you here anymore. We don't want you in jail. All you have to do is say that you're not going to practice. Just say, we're not going to practice polygamy anymore, and we'll let you go. And his grandfather stood up and said, I will not deny what I believe in and I will stand for the truth, and I am going to practice polygamy. And they had to keep him longer than all the other men that he was with. So
he was one of the few that stood up and said, no, I will not say this is wrong. I know this is truth. And I guess a quick story there that my father did share with me, that he remembers that while his father was in prison, my grandfather, at times when they were transported to go do some manual labor, the people in prison, they were transferred in a truck to go do some manual labor to help out. And as they were going from one place to another, they were actually, I guess some of these men were good friends with the driver of the truck. And so they actually were allowed to drive past their families' homes on the way to work. And the families would stand out and wave. And my father remembers standing out in front of his house, waving to his father, driving back and forth in this prison vehicle. So, he got to see him. And it turns out that the driver of that truck was a direct descendant to my mother, which is interesting how that connection all worked out. But anyway, so my father has experiences and stories, but being so young, he doesn't recall all of that.
There's one last matter of history I just want to make really clear to the people that are learning about this for the first time. The modern Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints kind of likes to create the impression that they have nothing to do with polygamy and they have nothing to do with the FLDS Church and all these people down in southern Utah. But what's dishonest about that is that not only was Joseph Smith a polygamist and had over 30 wives, underage wives, other men's wives, but it's currently in the Mormon Church's Doctrine and Covenants as doctrine. If you go to section 132 of the LDS Church's Doctrine and Covenants, polygamy is all there spelled out. So it's still doctrinal. Not only did Joseph Smith through the prophet before David O. McKay, they all practiced it. And most importantly, pretty much every prophet from Joseph Smith until Heber J. Grant stated that it was doctrine, that polygamy was an eternal doctrine, that it was an essential doctrine, and that polygamy would never be rescinded from the earth, that it couldn't, that it was God's law. They denounced heterosexual sort of monogamy. They denounced it in General Conference, and they claimed that exaltation or achieving the highest degree of salvation in the celestial kingdom, in the Mormon Church, polygamy was required for that. And we're not talking, Warren Jeffs here. We're talking about, people like Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow, prophets like that, LDS Church prophets making those sorts of statements. And then when you add to that all that the early Mormon pioneers and settlers sacrificed, partly because of living polygamy, to then you can see why there was a big branch of fundamentalist Mormons that said, we can't betray all that we've sacrificed. We can't betray the prophets and what they taught. They're men of God. And so in my view, there's a real integrity to the FLDS, to the fundamentalist strains of Mormonism, because in my view, they're living more true to Joseph Smith and Brigham Young's Mormonism than the modern church. And instead of being viewed as dishonorable, dishonest, criminal weirdos, they, in my mind, at least before Warren Jeffs was sleeping with 13-year-olds, you know what I mean? They deserve to be, in some sense, respected for living true Mormonism. And so I just wanted to kind of make that defense on your behalf.
Yes, well, and something to keep in mind too is a lot of the persecution in the early church was because of polygamy.
Yeah.
Dealing with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. And so a lot of, my grandfather included, they would say, hey, we can't just now say, no, we're not going to do this anymore. A lot of what we went through and a lot of the difficulties we went through was because we're staying true to this law.
Yeah, everything else would be in vain. Why would we dishonor our entire past and everything that, all the sacrifices everybody went through, if we're going to just deny it at the end, right? We're supposed to endure to the end.
Yeah.
And the FLDS really, truly live that. They believe that they're enduring to the end.
Yeah.
And my father would definitely say that he is living the law, the restored gospel.
Yes.
That the polygamy was part of this restoration, and it's necessary to return and to be in the highest degree of glory.
Did they ever teach that the mainstream LDS faith would again start to practice polygamy? Was that ever taught with you guys? Or I'm just wondering about that. Like if they ever said anything about
that people from the FLDS said?
Yeah.
If they taught, I'm sorry, the question is if they taught me that eventually
The mainstream LDS people would come back into like polygamy or into your fold again?
Well, they looked at the, I don't know that this was actually taught in the church.
But it was definitely rumored.
But it was rumored that growing up in the FLDS, we looked at the mainstream Mormon church as the great and abominable church talked about in the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
And they would say that because it's one of those things that, these people had the truth. And then they went astray. That's what we were told.
Yep.
We were told that the mainstream LDS church were the great and abominable church that went astray and didn't want to follow what Joseph Smith taught.
Yeah, they were apostates. And so, I mean, kind of on that lines of almost sons of perdition because they had the truth and they let go of it. So, I mean, once it's a couple generations, they just believe that they were led by false prophets. And so not quite as much the apostates or sons of perdition. But initially when it split, all of those people that chose to follow the mainstream people were
they would consider them
considered
apostates. And the rest of everyone that belonging to the church now, they would just consider them Gentiles, people that never had the full truth. And that on the other side, if they don't choose to accept it on this earth, that on the other side, they would have a chance to accept the truth. That's what they would say.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for your patience with the history. I get people telling me we don't know the history. You talk about this stuff like we know it already. So for those who knew the history, sorry. For those who didn't know the history, we hope that was helpful. End of history lesson. Now to your story.
No problem at all. So anyway, I'm trying to switch back here. I don't want to talk or mention something that I already talked about, but so at the time that polygamy was put to an end, like I mentioned briefly, my grandfather was very much a part of continuing on this polygamy way of life. He was thrown into prison for quite some time.
So in the 1890s and after.
Exactly.
Okay. Great-grandfather.
My great-grandfather. Okay. No, sorry. This was just my grandfather.
Oh.
Yes.
Okay.
There's very long periods of when you have so many children.
Yes.
So
and my father now is in his 80s. So
yeah, his father is older than my grandparents. So.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So there's a
very big generation spans.
How old are you right now?
I'm 31.
So it's 2022. You're 31, and your grandfather lived in the 1890s.
How about that, huh? Yes. Yes.
That's so crazy.
I know, right?
Yeah. I have. I mean, I don't want to go way off track here, but just a fun fact: I have siblings that are they're plenty old enough to be my father.
He has siblings that are older than my parents are.
Yes. Yeah.
So.
And then some that are still very young. So anyway, a very long range of siblings.
Down to teenagers. From older than my parents to still young teenagers is the span of his father's children.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
We had a big family.
Okay.
But anyway, so my grandfather was actually, I believe eventually the story has it that they just kicked him out of prison, said, okay, you're obviously not a bad man. You're just trying to live the best you can. And it sounds like they just eventually said, he's not going to ever say that he doesn't believe in polygamy, so let's just let him go. So they let him go. And that was that. After, I don't know exactly, do you remember how long he was in?
I want to say it was a year. Well, it was a year when everyone else got released, and then I think he stayed for 3 or 4 more months.
A little longer, so
about a year and a half in prison for it.
Yeah. But from every story I've heard, and he wrote a lot in his journals while being in prison, and we're reading through those right now to get more information.
You have those journals?
We do.
Yes.
Yes.
One of his, was it an aunt, had actually, so he had written them in just normal like composition notebooks, all by hand and cursive, like his entire life story. And then there was another one, but 2 volumes, and she actually just like carbon copied them and put them into a hardbound book. And luckily reached out and said, is anybody interested in a copy of these, because we're going to do 1 printing of these? And we were like, absolutely. And so we have these beautiful hardbound copies of his journals that we're trying to read through.
So we're reading through those right now, and we'll have more information as time goes on. But
on Year of Polygamy, on Growing Up Polygamy podcast or YouTube channel. Yeah.
So, but very interesting. And he, from everything I've heard and everything that I've read, he was just an outstanding guy, my grandfather. So just trying to live
Tell
the
us
best.
his name one last time.
Charles Zitting.
Charles Zitting. Okay. Okay.
And he, was just trying to live the best he could. And he was very much involved in the leadership as the FLDS church began.
Okay. So that's Charles.
Yeah.
Yep, that's
Charles.
him.
Who comes after Charles?
So after Charles, my father, also very, very well known throughout the community, someone that was very well respected and looked up to, had very high callings in the church, patriarch, and was also the mayor of Hilldale City for a long, long time.
Do you want to use his name or do you not want to use his name?
I don't think it. I think people can probably guess at this point if anyone's curious because they know of us out there. But his name's David. David Zitting.
David Zitting. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
He was a patriarch.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So he had for those of you that don't know, being a patriarch is a very, very high calling within the church. And it's one of those things that he would actually be a speaker and give talks in some of the general meetings because of his calling.
And in the FLDS, speaking in church is a much higher calling. It's a much bigger deal. So in the LDS church, the congregation, people get assigned randomly from the ward. But in the FLDS, they weren't randomly assigned. The speakers were always high priesthood holders.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Right. Yes. There was never a general testimony meeting where someone could stand up from the audience and go share their testimony. That would have been interesting. That could have gone because there are so many people in the FLDS because it was such a high demand religion. There were some people in the audience that didn't agree with a lot of what was going on, especially once the Jeffs took over. So had they had a chance to stand up in front of everyone and bear their so-called testimony, it could have gotten very interesting in those meetings. So I think that's why they only allowed people that were very high in the church to give any kind of talk over the pulpit.
I'm going to ask this about David, but do you know how many wives and children Charles had?
Oh my goodness. I have been told this. I believe he had 3 or 4 wives, I believe.
Okay. Any idea how many children?
I don't know exactly how many children. No.
I know. I'm like trying to think of the family tree. I'm like,
Okay.
It's hard to keep track
It's a
of
very
everyone.
big tree.
In this big of a family, it's hard to keep track of the exact numbers.
But you need 3, as I understand it, you need 3 to reach the highest degree of the
Correct.
celestial kingdom.
See,
So he
that's-
reached that threshold.
That's interesting because that's not something I was told growing up.
Oh, okay.
So when some people would ask me, do you need a certain number of wives to reach the highest degree of heaven? I would tell them, no, I don't think so, because I was never told that. But now some of these people that were closer with Warren Jeffs and closer with the leaders, they are saying that this is what they were told. I mean, I guess that is true.
In most high demand religions or cults, there's kind of this secret inner knowledge that isn't
Yes.
shared with the outer
Yes.
members. Okay, how about David, your dad, the patriarch? Do you know how many wives and children?
Oh, yes.
yeah.
Yes. Yes. That now I'm familiar. So 4 wives.
Okay.
And my mother is the second wife.
And then how many kids do you know?
Well, so biological siblings I have, and I'll explain why I say biological. Biological siblings, I have 35. But as far as full-blooded from just my mother alone, there's 12 of us. But if we're going to include the 4th wife, they're not actually biologically related to me because the 4th wife was married into the family after she was a widow. And so her children were already grown and moved out of the house and all adults before she joined our family. And so she was joined and became another mother as well. But all of her siblings, I never got super close with her children because they were already all out of the house. But if we include her children as well, there were 45.
Okay, so 10 more, like non-biological siblings.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what do you want to say? Do you know the profession? Did you say what Charles Zitting's profession was?
Oh, boy.
Do you know? It's okay if you don't. I was just curious if you...
I cannot think off the top of my head what he did.
That's fine.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
How about David? What was your dad's profession? And is there anything about his childhood or adolescence or adulthood that are important parts of the story?
Yes. So he he did a lot of things, I guess, growing up. He owned a ranch and was in charge of running a big ranch there in Utah, southern Utah, and he had an entrepreneur type mindset. So he started a few different things over his younger adult life. But very early on, after I guess not joining, he was born into the church. But after he was married, very shortly after that, he became the mayor of Hilldale, which is the Utah side of Short Creek, and did that for many, 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 many years.
Okay.
That's when I was born, he was already the mayor, and that's all I knew. That's the only profession that I saw him do. So
wow, that's a big job.
Oh yeah. And it was a huge job because, he just had so much going on all the time. It seems like he was always in meetings. And because of his position, I felt that our family probably had a little bit more of a connection to the outside world, because we would have people coming in and wanting to talk to him and interview him, and so he had that connection to the news reporters and some of the other government officials and that would come in and talk to him.
And you said he's how old now?
Oh my goodness, I don't want to get this wrong. I believe 82.
Okay, so somebody do the math. 2022 minus 82. Do you know what year he was born? I just want to kind of get a sense for the year he was born.
Oh my goodness gracious! I should have my numbers figured
I'm guessing
out.
1940.
40.
I'm guessing 1940.
I believe yes, that sounds right.
Okay. All right. So wow, that's interesting. So he was born like pre-World War II.
It's crazy to think about. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you partially answered this. In the Mormon church, a patriarch is kind of an older person that gives patriarchal blessings, which is kind of like fortune telling for Mormons, basically crystal ball kind of fortune telling of what your future is going to be. You get that blessing when you're a teenager. What did it mean to be a patriarch in the FLDS church, in addition to whatever you've already told us?
Yeah, no, very similar actually. And I remember it was also done in our home. So I remember people would show up to our house and they would meet with father and actually normally his first wife, and she was the scribe. So she would write down the blessing as he gave it, just to have record of what it was, so that the person that was receiving the blessing would have a copy. And yeah, so very, very similar, because I got a patriarchal blessing in the LDS church as well when I joined. And so
You've got two.
I've got two. No, actually, I never got one with my father. I got a lot of priesthood blessings, which are a little bit different, but never a patriarchal blessing. I believe you had to be a certain age. I believe you had to be 18 years old, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
And he left right after he was 18.
Yes.
So. Okay.
So, but very similar. All I know is people would show up to the home and they would go up into the upstairs living room and shut the doors, and then they would receive their patriarchal blessing. I was never there to witness exactly what it was or how he did it, but I assume it was very similar. It seemed like it was to the LDS church blessings.
So in addition to being mayor and having eventually 4 wives and eventually like 35 to 45 kids, he would give lots of patriarchal blessings.
Yes.
And that was viewed as I guess, can you describe what the organization of the FLDS church would have been prior to Warren, when your dad, David, was kind of growing up FLDS? What the structure pre-Warren, like in the LDS church, there's a prophet, a first presidency of 2 counselors in the prophet, and then a quorum of the 12 apostles.
Yep.
And a presiding bishopric, and a bunch of 70s. What was the organization prior to Warren?
So
that you know of?
Prior to Warren that I know of, there was the prophet, the leader of the church, and there were his counselors.
Do you remember who the prophets would have been prior to Warren, as far back as you can remember?
Well, before Warren, it was his father, Reuben Jeffs.
Okay.
Before Reuben Jeffs, it was Roy Johnson. Before him, it was John Y. Barlow. Before him, it was, I believe, I hope I'm not forgetting someone, Lauren Woolley. And before him, John Woolley. And I believe John Woolley was the first prophet of the FLDS church.
That was really good.
I hope I didn't forget anyone.
We have a song that helps us remember our prophet.
Yeah, I always sing it too. Every time I'm going through,
Yeah. Okay, that's okay. So your dad would have known most of those prophets personally.
I believe he knew when he was young. I believe he grew up with John Y. Barlow being the prophet. And then he had most of his really good experiences growing up was with Roy Johnson as the prophet. He cannot say enough good about him. He just goes on and on and on about how he was the most amazing man. And it's from everything I hear, it seems like if you talk to other people throughout the community that were around during that time, everyone only has good to say about Roy Johnson. Seemed like a very, very good guy. When the Jeffs took over, even Rulon Jeffs, before Warren Jeffs, it seemed like things started to have a little bit of a shift,
Okay.
I guess you could say.
Yeah, because like even my intent in doing these episodes isn't to shame non-monogamy. You know, there are lots of people that figure out ways to live their life, and maybe it's even theoretically possible for there to be ethical. Well, of course, there's ethical non-monogamy, but maybe there's even, I don't even know if polygamy can be ethical, but I like to think that there can be just people who are just faithful, believing people who are honest and moral and kind and good people, and they're just sincerely following their beliefs.
And I would say the same about my father and my mother. 100%. They're just trying to do the best they can, live the best lives they can. I don't think they have ever had a bad intention on as far as leading us astray or trying to convince us of something that they didn't fully believe. I believe that was, they've only tried to live the best they could with what they were given.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
Okay, so David is mayor and patriarch. Anything else you want to say about his life that will help us understand your story better prior to your birth? Or do we cover the most important
I think
things?
we covered most of it. I will just say that he gave up everything for the church. He had businesses that he had started, lots of things going for him. But when the leader of the church snapped their fingers and said, okay, this is where we need you, he said, okay.
Very faithful.
And very, very, very faithful, would give up anything for the church. And he, growing up in my younger years, we lived in a double-wide trailer home with a lot of family, you know? So it's one of those things that just goes to prove that, hey, you know, if this is where you want me, regardless of the living conditions, I'll be there. And it wasn't until later on, about maybe 9 or 10 years old, that we moved into a bigger home. So when I was 9 or 10 years old.
I'm just remembering one of my favorite hymns growing up, LDS. I'll go where you want me to go, dear Lord. I'll say what you want me to say. I'll be, I'll do what you want me to do. I'll be what you want me to be.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And they really lived that, like, so there's not many times I feel like, because growing up LDS, that was the same thing, you know, you hear those, but I feel like the things that we were asked to do never felt as extreme, right? You look at the FLDS and you're like, they were asked to do so much that it makes the things that I was asked to do as LDS look not like that big of a deal, you know,
But if you go back to the early days of the church, they were asked to give up a lot.
It's true.
And to do a lot of things. And the FLDS church believe, or at least the members, I don't know about Warren, we'll get into him later, but as far as the members that are faithful members of the FLDS church, they looked at their experience as, we know this is true because we're going through the same persecution. We're dealing with the same things that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young had to deal with. It's obvious that it's true because Satan is trying to attack us, just like he did back in those days, right? And now they've thrown our prophet into prison. See, just like Joseph Smith. It's
a fulfillment of prophecy.
Exactly.
Okay, so you said you were born to the second wife. Do you want to talk about where you are in the birth order and what year were you were born?
I was born in 1991. Sorry, that was when my wife was born. I was born in 1990.
Okay.
And I was right in the middle of my mother's children. I say mother just in case everyone's wondering, because growing up in the FLDS, we were not allowed to use the names dad and mom. That was never allowed.
Disrespectful.
It was considered disrespectful. So we had to say father and mother. And for the other mothers that were not our biological mother, we would call them mother and then their first name. So let's say their name was Diana, you would say Mother Diana. But for our mother, we would just say mother. So
Okay, so you refer to the sister. I guess is sister wives a
Sister wife.
pejorative? Was that was that an okay term to use?
Yes, it was. It seemed like it was okay.
So for those who don't know, sister wife means what?
So another wife to the same man. So for example, I mean, my father had 4 wives, and so there were 4 sister wives that would. I'm trying to remember. I don't know that they would refer to themselves as sister wives, or if they would just refer to them as the other mothers of the family, because that's how it was. We weren't in like some other polygamous groups you'll see on TV. All the mothers have their own home. But no, we all lived in the same house, under the same roof. We all grew up together, all the mothers, all the children. So, I mean, I was probably just as close, if not closer, to some of the children from another mother because they were closer to my age growing up.
Yeah.
So it was all just one big family.
So when you were born, how many siblings had already been born in total? Do you even know? Like 20 at least?
At least.
Yeah, you got to be in the middle, about the middle
I'm
somewhere.
right in the. I'm in the middle everywhere you look at it. I'm in the middle of all of the siblings. I'm in the middle of my mother's, and my mother's the middle wife. I'm in the middle everywhere.
Yeah, and his mother, being the second wife, was married 15 years after the first wife.
Mm-hmm.
So father and
wow.
his first wife had a lot of children before he even married Sam's mother, who then started having children. And his mother and the third wife got married a lot closer in gap. So there's a lot of the same age children. Like some of his half brothers are like 3 months apart from him. And they're like really close together because those 2 mothers were having children at the same time. Where the first wife had a lot of children.
She had all of her children before I was born.
Before, the second wife even starting their family.
Yeah.
So your dad, David, had already married 3 times before you were born?
Correct.
So you were born with 3 moms,
Yep.
basically.
Grew up in the home, and I didn't think anything of it. It seemed perfectly normal and natural to me.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there were one of the moms you'd have to watch out for. She was a little bit more strict, right? So we would kind of pick and choose which mom we were going to ask to get away with something because we knew which one would be more lenient. Most of the moms would just say, ask father. Father had the final say no matter what.
Okay.
And when the fourth mother came, all the boys were excited because they thought maybe there was a new mother that they could get away with more from.
We thought that I remember very, very vividly. We were still living in our double wide trailer home, and we were waiting for the 4th mother to show up because we knew that father had gone to be married to his 4th wife. And so we were just waiting. Okay, who's it going to be? We had no idea. We were hoping that it was going to be some very young girl that would be able to, that we could go to and get away with anything. Because she would be a mother, she could give us permission for things. So we're hoping that she'd be a young girl that would say, sure, do whatever you want and not be too strict. But as we...
Jen, why are you smiling? Why are you smiling, Jen?
I'm just still stuck on you were all in a double wide trailer.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like I'm still stuck on your first sentence.
Well,
The 3 wives, and then they're going to add another
And
one,
like
right?
20 something at least, right? Kids.
there were in the 20s that were there at a time because some were older and would
double-wide
get married.
trailer.
Yeah. And I will say,
crazy.
I will say that there was a double wide trailer was the main home. And then we did have a single wide trailer right next to it that was kind of a workshop and did have 2 bedrooms. So some of the family lived there as well.
That's better.
So,
Just kidding. I'm just joking.
It's a little bit of an addition, right?
No.
So anyway, I forget where we were.
Well, let me. I'm going to give a disclaimer first. Like, whenever we're talking about, I learned this a lot talking to transgender individuals that there are ways you can exoticize and even exploit people, and there are common stereotypical questions that get asked that can be perceived as really rude or offensive or exploitative, and that's never the spirit with which I want to do these interviews.
Right.
But I know that just like with the transgender community, with the polygamous community, there are questions around like living arrangements, around bedrooms, around beds, around sex that are highly offensive. So I want to start by saying I don't want to talk about anything. I don't want to exploit you. I don't want to be disrespectful to you or your people. And so I just want to kind of set that tone and disclaimer. And I'll just say, of course, there are certain types of questions that typically get asked around living arrangements. And so maybe that's a general way I'll say, are there, and this is to educate people so they can be more respectful, are there questions that get asked that are off limits or highly offensive around living arrangements, or are there things that are actually, from your perspective, okay to talk about? And I'm just going to kind of leave that general question there out of respect, and then let you talk about all the things you imagine I'm talking about.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, and thank you for being respectful. And but really quick, I'll just finish. I remember what I was in the middle of saying, and I'll just finish this, and then I'll jump right into that question. We were all, as young girls and boys, looking out the window, waiting for the fourth mom to show up, and we couldn't actually even, when Father pulled up, we couldn't see. We were like, who? No one's in the car, and she's a very short lady, pure white hair, and we were just like, oh no. We're not going to get away with anything. So just a very, anyway, but she turned out to be one of the best additions to the family. She was a very lovely lady, and we loved having her. So,
okay.
But as far as sleeping arrangements and all of that, that's a very common question, as you can imagine why. And luckily for me, I don't have a whole ton of information. So there's not a whole lot of disrespectful things that I could talk about, because there were rumors, and people would say, this is what I saw, this is what I heard, or whatever. But me personally, I'll speak from my personal experience. It didn't seem that odd growing up in it, but it was never talked about. It was very, very hush-hush. Everything sexual was just off the table. We couldn't ask about it. It wasn't something that anyone would ever talk about. So it was just, I don't know. It was never anything that I really cared too much about growing up out there. All I know is that in the home, each mother had her own room, and father had his room. Obviously, there's a lot of children, so they got together at some point, but I don't know exactly how those arrangements worked. And a lot of the mothers would have their infants staying in the same room with them, and then once they got a little bit older, there were boys' rooms, there were girls' rooms, there were younger boys' rooms, younger girls' rooms, and we were kind of split up that way throughout the house.
Beautiful. That makes sense. So I can imagine, I'm trying to think of like these cabins, in Heber or wherever, where like all the cousins all sleep together in one big room. I'm imagining something like that for the kids.
Yes, a lot of us.
Bunk beds, like.
Yeah, bunk beds was a very, very common thing. When you, as a younger boy, that's what it was. It was just a room with a bunch of bunk beds in it, and you kind of put as many in there as you could for sleeping. And once you got a little bit older in your teenage years, then you would advance to the older boys' room, at least speaking from my personal experience. And then oftentimes we would have our own bed. No more bunk bed, had our own bed. So
you'd have to share, sometimes as a kid, you would share beds? With other kids?
What I refer to by your own bed is it wasn't a bunk bed, but generally speaking, we had our own twin size mattress. Okay, exactly. Yes.
Okay.
So, but it was, it just made sense. It was, to me growing up, we kind of kept everyone in the same age group the best we could. And then obviously separated the boys and girls. Boys and girls weren't really allowed to do much together at all growing up. They didn't want us to really play that much together or work together. We kind of had separate chores. And my sisters, even in the house, they were always fully clothed, and from wrist to ankle. And us boys were expected to dress that way as well. Even our pajamas, we were completely covered.
Wrist to ankle, talk about that.
Yeah. So basically, the dress or the uniform code, I guess you could say, was for the guys a button-up shirt, long sleeve buttoned-up shirt. Always should be tucked in. If you want to get on your parents' good side, do up the top button. and then pants.
Seriously?
Yes.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah, I mean, my parents would have loved it if I had walked around with my top button done up all the time.
So was it viewed a tiny bit as rebellion to have your top button unbuttoned, or?
That was one of the things that was okay. It was okay to have your top button undone. I think that because a lot of the leaders would also undo their top button just for comfort reasons.
Wow.
Right? But if you roll up your sleeves now, oh boy.
Really?
Do not roll up your
Are you
sleeves.
serious?
Uh-huh. They want
As a man, boy, or as a woman or girl?
anything. Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the women's sleeves normally had like cuffs on the bottom of their dresses anyway, around their wrists, so they wouldn't really be able to roll it up. But the men's like dress shirts like this, show your that would be a
this wouldn't be
big
allowed.
no. That
You'd
would
have
not
to
be allowed.
Down and not even undo the button. Do the button up. No undone button. And yes, this was also expected of us while working in
Southern Utah heat.
Southern Utah heat outside. We never were able to wear short sleeves or shorts or any of that type of thing.
Wow.
So-
I didn't know this.
Yes, very strict dress code.
And part of that reason was, do you want to talk a little bit about the garments?
Yes, sure. So we had an undergarment that we would wear. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe we all started wearing them at age 8 after being baptized.
You started wearing what?
An undergarment. We called them garments. And
Was it religious?
yes.
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It was actually, so if, I don't know how familiar your viewers are with LDS garments, but just as a little bit of a comparison and history that I learned as we were looking into this together. But when Joseph Smith originally received revelation of what the garment should look like, it did go wrists all the way to your ankles. And the FLDS kept the original garment that Joseph Smith had restored and had a revelation of how it was supposed to be. So while the LDS garment continued to kind of progress and change through time and through different styles, the FLDS kept it in its purity as what it was. And instead of a temple garment, it was something that once you were baptized, you received it.
Yes.
Okay, I'm confused.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in the Mormon church, you don't start wearing your garments until you are a young adult. When you go through the temple and you take out your endowment, and at the temple, that's when you swear the oaths, get your new name, learn the signs, tokens, and in my case, the penalties, and they do your washings and anointings in the temple with oil while you're almost naked, and then they put on a garment that has Masonic symbols on it, a square and a compass and I guess a ruler. And then on the bottom parts, there's a line on your navel and then a little sewn in line right above your knee. And that's what the garments are in the LDS church, and that's when you get them. And of course, they're short sleeve now, and they're like biker shorts for men and women. Well, that's its own episode. We've talked about that in the past. So was there an endowment for kids? Was there a temple ceremony for kids? Were there markings on the kids' garments? And were they the same markings?
So really I guess you could say the ritual that was done to then receive your garments was, I guess you would say, baptism. And there were no markings. It was just a white garment that would completely cover your body from your neck to your ankles to your wrists. And because of that undergarment, it was necessary to wear your long jeans or slacks and button-up shirts and all of that just to cover your garments. Same thing with your pajamas. You had to make sure your garments were covered. But there were no markings on them at all.
And it was also, just again for any LDS viewers, it also was not a replacement for underwear. They would still wear underwear.
Regular underwear over top.
Over top of their
Because there
garments.
was obviously a cutout for going to the bathroom.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
So
Many people don't. It's
I've
actually
never heard that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
many people don't know about that. But let me tell you, the first time I took that off and went with regular clothes on, I felt like I was naked, without those garments on, because I was raised. It's not something you get when you're an adult. You're raised that way. And
What are you told as you're an 8-year-old getting baptized? What are you told the garments mean?
a symbol of your righteousness and willingness to follow God.
Are you taught that they have special powers to protect you?
We were always taught that it was important to obey commandments, important to obey our leaders and all of those things. And the garment was just a piece of that obedience. So it wasn't necessarily you're going to have superpowers if you wear these, but it was just overall, this is a part of being obedient. If you're obedient, you'll be protected. So I don't remember any specific promises with the garment other than just it was required.
And for the women, it was a big sign of modesty as well. Again, it helped you remain modest, from his sisters that have told me about it. And they said, yeah, it's another way, like that has to be covered. So then you avoid the rolling up of sleeves or making sure that your ankles are showing, like all those type of things. It just created a very standard modesty standard as well by having it from a very young age that those couldn't be shown. And so whatever you wore, even with the full prairie dresses, they would wear leggings underneath, and then they would wear socks to go up. A lot of them
would wear ride horses, ride bikes, that type of thing. So if their dress was flying up, they would have a pair of leggings or something underneath.
So like 4 layers. Like there's garments, underwear, leggings, and then a blouse?
And slips. So for the women, then they'd have their garments, they'd have underwear, then they would wear slips, and then they would wear their dresses.
Wow.
Speaking of their dress code, this wasn't really allowed in my family, so I'm happy for the other family that was able to do this. But I recently spoke with somebody that I met, and when they realized where I was from, they said, no way, so you'd be familiar with this type of thing. I guess they were at Lake Powell, a big lake here in southern Utah, and I guess they're in southern Utah. I'm no longer in southern Utah. And they were at the lake boating, and they saw this boat just flying across the lake, and someone on water skis behind the boat, just cruising behind this boat, water skiing. And they had their big prairie dress just flying up in the air behind them, their braided hair, the poof on their head, and they're just going down the lake behind the boat. So even for water, any type of activity, we were never allowed to get into any type of swimsuit or that type of thing.
So swimsuits were forbidden?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, they weren't allowed to go into the water because Satan controls the waters.
Any big bodies of water. We were allowed to play in small bodies of water, and when doing so, I wore my jeans and a button-up shirt.
So this woman jet skiing was breaking the rules, but still wearing the clothes?
She would have had to been breaking some kind of rule. I don't know, though, because here's something that I learned as I got older. There were families that were a lot less strict than my family that would take the rules of
in
the church.
Hilldale.
In Hilldale, yes.
Okay.
And also some that were in Canada and some that were in Salt Lake.
Okay.
And they would sometimes be a little bit more lenient when it came to the rules of the church.
Like unbutton their top button maybe 2 times or something.
Yeah.
Exactly. Or roll their sleeves up.
I feel like it's very similar to the LDS in that sense that, in certain families, it was like no short shorts, no tank tops. And then some families you could wear, a tank top in the summertime or short shorts, and it wasn't as big of a deal. It was more of a family by family matter. There were definitely rules in the FLDS that were a family by family matter.
Mm-hmm. I'll just say that, religion is often counterintuitive, and religious devotion is often counterintuitive. Sociologists have shown, sometimes you think, well, if the church will become more relaxed, then the members would be more devout and loyal because the rules would be perceived as just suffocating. And if you loosen up the rules, then you'll get more devoted members. And people will say, why can't the current LDS church just let people drink coffee? Like let them drink beer. Mm-hmm. Then more people will stay. But the truth is, sociologists have demonstrated the opposite is true. The more demanding the church is, the more allegiance the church elicits from its members. Mm-hmm. So by being super strict and controlling, that made you all more committed than regular LDS church members probably are.
Oh, well, 100%, and for several reasons. One, just being the fact, okay, well, every aspect of our life was determined. Everything. And everything the church owned. So we felt like the church owned us, and we had to abide by the rules. But secondly, it was, they would keep us from a lot of the outside world. So a lot of the normal information you can go out there and find was not available to us. So, that was another thing that they would control, that we weren't allowed to see media and news and that type of thing.
Yeah. and we can talk about the bite model, but we'll hold off on that till later. Okay, so growing up as the number what kid in
I would have had to been right around 20.
but with your mom, who is the second wife,
I would have been number 6.
okay, you were number 6 of 10
of 12.
of 12, but then of total, you were what number?
Around 20.
Right around
20.
I'm trying
Okay.
to remember if it was 19 or 21, but right in that number.
So talk about, what your family life was like and what your religious and spiritual life was like as a fundamentalist Mormon kid, LDS,
definitely.
FLDS kid. Yeah.
Yeah, so like many would probably say, before Warren Jeffs and before Warren's dad had a stroke.
And that year would have been around what year?
So about 2000 and right around 2000, 2001 is when things were starting to change a little bit. Because
so you would have been 10 or 11 when things started to change. So you had a good 10 years pre-Warren Jeffs' significant influence.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, he started to have some influence because his dad started to get sick,
Yeah.
and he started to have, or he stood up and basically said, "I'm speaking for my dad, and this is what he wants me to do." And so he started speaking for his dad pretty early on.
But Rulin was the prophet when you were born.
Correct.
Okay.
And was for several years.
So for those first 10 years, what was growing up FLDS
It
like?
was awesome.
Really?
It was. It was.
Talk about how awesome it was.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I had a lot of siblings around growing up, a lot to do, a lot of friends to play with, I guess you could say, that were there with me, growing up with me, going through the same experience. Our backyard was the mountains. We lived in a very remote place that we were allowed to go out and roam freely for the most part until we got caught and sent back home. But we were allowed to go and play and build rock forts on the mountain and ride our bikes around town. And it seemed like a very tight community. Everyone knew each other, and it was just I felt like a very good childhood. Father would try hard to take us on trips, camping trips, picnic trips, up to places around nearby like Cedar Mountain and Pine Valley Mountain, which are mountains not too far from St. George, Utah. And so it seemed like he tried hard to give us a good life, even though he had so many children. It was very rare that we would all get to go at the same time. But he did make sure that at least once a year, we all got together, not only our immediate family, but also some extended family. And we did this celebration picnic day on Pine Valley Mountain. And it was to celebrate his birthday. But it was something that was put on every year, that we were all allowed to get together and have a great time.
You wouldn't do that for each of the moms or sister wives, right?
No.
Just his birthday.
Yes.
Okay.
And I don't know if I don't know where that came from, if it was something that he decided or if it was something that the mother said, "Hey, we want to do this each year." That I can't say. It was already happening when I was born, so I'm not sure how it started. I was just happy to go be there for the ride. So
So one fringe benefit was having lots of siblings you could play with. That
Yes.
would be fun.
And the area that we lived in was fun. We had a creek that ran through town. We would spend a lot of time playing in that, and mountains. We had a great time. A lot of outdoor activity that we were allowed to do.
It's super hot down there. Like we mentioned the 4 or 5 layers, but that's also living in 100 to 120 degree weather. Am I wrong?
Well, on the border where we grew up, it was a little cooler than you would find in St. George, Utah.
Okay.
So
She kind of went up into the
you go up the
hills.
mountain a little ways, but it still got, in the 90s and low hundreds during the summer. So it definitely got hot, and also we got some snow during the winter time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
So it wasn't quite St. George.
no,
weather.
not quite.
Okay.
However, just a quick, insight to that heat we dealt with. We worked a lot in St. George. Once we got older, as young men, we would go and work on construction sites in this 120 degree weather, and we kept that same clothing.
So tell people where Hilldale or Colorado City are relative to St. George, just for people who don't know the geography.
Yes, so it is southeast, about 45 minutes. And if you go through Hurricane, Utah, or as it's called, Hurricane, if you're local, and you go through Hurricane, Utah, and up the mountain towards the east and head southeast, you take the, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the main highway there. Is it the 50? I don't remember the highway there. It's been a while. But anyway, you take that road towards Lake Powell, and you'll go through the small town of Short Creek.
They're right on the backside of Zion National Park. So like if you go from, if you hike up the mountains where he grew up as a kid, you would literally come up over those mountains into Zion National Park. So it's really beautiful.
Yes.
You have all those mountains.
Yeah, you have the backside of Zion there. It's very beautiful. I know of some hikers that would make that hike from Zion over into Short Creek, and it's not an easy hike, but it's definitely something that can be done. And there were natural springs there, so it's got a lot. It's a very nice and good place to live. I mean, it's very remote, but it's very beautiful.
Okay. That's helpful. I think I've only driven through one time, and I didn't stop. I just drove through. So I remember seeing it. Yeah.
Had you heard much about I'm curious because a lot of people heard a lot of negative about the community that say, don't stop, just keep going. There's people in their trucks and guns and things.
Yeah. Yeah. What I would have heard, I wouldn't have heard of this growing up in Texas in the 80s as an Orthodox Mormon. I wouldn't have even known much of the FLDS church at all growing up. But once I went to BYU and lived there long enough, I would have heard of the FLDS church. And once I started paying attention to it, I would have been told lots of Amish looking people, weird hairdos. And I don't mean to be disrespectful. This is how it would have been communicated to me. Poofy women, poofy, weird hairdos with long dresses looking like pioneers.
Yep.
That if you went into town, people would follow you, they would intimidate you, threaten you, that it was kind of really secretive and scary to go there. And then also you would hear that for tax reasons, no one would ever actually complete their homes, that they would leave their homes partially unfinished because then they would somehow avoid taxes by never actually completing their homes. So there was an impression that it was kind of dilapidated, run down, scary police state. Now, I don't know how much of that was influenced by Warren Jeffs, or if my memories of being taught those things would have also predated Warren Jeffs.
Yeah.
But I feel bad saying those things to you.
Yeah.
But and I'm a little bit resentful. I'll just be candid here. I'm a little bit resentful at how the Mormon Church has kind of like spoken ill of your people and tried to distance itself from your people. So part of why I like to talk about this stuff now is to try and atone for some of that, because I don't think all those negative things are fair or kind.
Right.
So I feel bad.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you. And you're just fine. Honestly, that's kind of the way that all the public saw. That's what they were told. So what do you expect, right? And there were, this did predate Warren Jeffs as well. So it's not one of those things that, I'm not shocked to hear it, honestly. And some of the things were true, right? Some of the things you heard were true. Very secretive. Very. No one really wanted to talk to the outsiders. There were, I guess they were called the God Squad, or some of the security people would drive their trucks around. And if an outsider pulled in, I was never a part of that, but I did hear of guys driving around and being a part of this security, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And so it was something that happened. From my knowledge, they were never intending on hurting anybody, but more just to intimidate them, to kind of scare them out of the town so they didn't feel welcome.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So, that's kind of the perception that many of us had, but I love hearing that for you, it was just this beautiful, idyllic childhood.
Right.
If you don't mind, let's talk a little bit more about that. I'm curious to know what your relationship was like with your mom, because she had a lot of kids herself, but then I'm guessing each sister wife helps with all the children. So can you talk about your relationship with your mom, your relationship with your, sister wives? I remember Ann Wild saying things like, hey, you get more moms. Like, what's wrong with more moms? It's more love. It's more moms. It's more siblings. What's not to like? So yeah, talk about your relationship with your mom, your relationship with your other moms.
Yeah, no, it was very, like I say, one big family, one big happy family, I guess you could say. Everyone was involved. And so not only did we have all of the moms taking care of us and helping out with the children, but also I had a lot of older siblings that were also there and helping out. And one of my older sisters from my father's first wife was actually a big part of raising me as a young child, as an infant and toddler.
Oh, so siblings can also play the role as parent a little bit.
Exactly, especially the older sisters. They had a big part of that. And it was very common for the older siblings to pitch in and help out. And but as far as my relationship with my mother, it was always very clear who belonged to who. As far as I knew from the moment I remember which mother I belonged to. There was never a big, everyone's kind of jumbled in together and nobody knows who's who. It was pretty clear. So that was, that was nice, I think. I know that later on, things got a lot more hectic and crazy. But as my very young years, things were very good. I did have a relationship with my mother. She would make sure to take time aside to meet with me and spend one-on-one time with me. We would even go shopping sometimes together. One fond memory I have of my mother is she would take me, just me, and sometimes we would go and get a cantaloupe from the store and some vanilla ice cream, and we would cut the cantaloupe in half, put a scoop of ice cream after taking the pits out, and we would just sit at a park and eat the cantaloupe and vanilla ice cream together and just have a one-on-one experience together. So that was very nice. And looking back on how much she had going on, I'm very thankful that she was able to do that and take that time out of her day.
Yeah. Okay. And when I'm thinking about what Ann Wild basically said, like, were you able to get close to your other moms, and did you even have like a strong emotional connection with them, or was it mostly just with your main mom?
Yes, we did. I feel like we had a good connection with all of the moms. Our biological mom was we had a stronger connection with her. I guess I should speak for myself. I believe it was the same for all of my other siblings, but there was my mother would take just her kids alone and meet with us all in her bedroom, and she was a very, very strict. She was all in, 1,000%. So she would take us aside and make sure her children were following the rules exactly, and we need to make sure we're following what Father says, and just she was very, very strict and wanted us to all be perfect children. So she would because of all the attention she gave us, I definitely had a stronger connection with her. But all of the mothers were in our day-to-day lives. We were very much involved and had a very strong connection with all of them, I would say.
I want to talk about those relationships between the moms' wives, but how much time do you remember spending with your dad growing up, one-on-one, if at all?
Yeah, see, that's a different story. So he was... to spend time with him normally meant you were in trouble for something. So as far as one-on-one time, he did try to go out of his way to make sure that he was there for family events and some family vacations and family morning and evening scripture study and prayer. So we saw him around a lot, but it wasn't much of a one-on-one relationship with him. It was more of you looked at him as a leader figure, not so much as a daddy, if that makes sense.
Oh, now that makes me a little sad, because I'm thinking about, like, I've made lots of mistakes as a dad, But if I look at the ability to have emotional relationships with my 4 kids, and almost like friendships is probably one of the most important things I do. That's not to say the way I do it's better than the way it was done, but it makes me sad for you, and it also makes me sad for your dad.
Right. And I mean, who knows? Maybe he would have done things completely different had he had his own way, and had he not been raised a certain way, and had he not had so many children, right? I mean, you can imagine how difficult that would be to have that one-on-one time with all of your children, having so many in the home, also having such a difficult and high-demanding job. So, you know, he was always doing something for the church or something for the city that he was the mayor of. And so, you know, he had a lot going on. So I can't necessarily blame him, but the circumstances were just, that's the way they were. And
it's a system.
Exactly. Who knows what he could have or wished he could have done differently. I can't speak for him.
And I do have to say too, that when Sam and I first met, because of that type of relationship, it's always been super, super important for him to be super close to our children. And it was a reason that we wanted a little bit smaller of a family than what, you know, a typical LDS family would look like. And it was super important for him to have a super close relationship. And he's an amazing father.
Oh, thank you.
So in terms of like these moments that a father-son might have where he gives wisdom one-on-one or encouragement or even anything, do you have memories like that with your dad?
Not one-on-one. It was more of a family setting where he would teach us and try to give us advice and that type of thing. Like I say, most of the one-on-one experience I had with him was because I did something I wasn't supposed to do. So then I got sent to the office to get into trouble. So that was
that's really all you.
That was the bulk of the one-on-one.
Oh, that makes me kind of sad. I'm not trying to impose that on you, but again, if my only one-on-one memories of my dad were getting in trouble, or if my only memories if my kids' only memories with me were getting in trouble, I would feel sad about that.
And you know, I wonder. I mean, I look back sometimes and wonder, you know, maybe I should have tried harder to have that connection. Maybe if I had randomly knocked on his door more often, maybe he would have been accepting and invited me in and loved to have that conversation. But because of the structure of the FLDS church, we looked at our father as a leader, dictator, not necessarily a buddy that we could go hang out with, right? Because of the way the church was. So I never felt like I could go and do that, you know, and so it was just one of those things where it was the way it was, and we just tried to stick together as siblings, and you know, get advice from each other. Maybe go to our older siblings if we wanted to know something.
Yeah, I mean, that's offset by how many moms you have and how many older and younger siblings you have. Right. Like I'm sure they're like you started with. You lose some things with your dad and maybe your mom, but then you gain a lot too. So I don't mean to paint it as all sad. Right. Right?
Yeah. No, I mean, growing up, I didn't feel, I mean, people are very resilient and, you know, depending on the situation, everyone has a story. And sometimes, you know, you just learn to deal with it. Right. And I know there's a lot of people out there that have a much worse situation than I do with my family. And so I was just grateful for try to focus on the positive things, right? I didn't realize how unique it was until I moved out. And then I look back and said, whoa, that was an interesting childhood, right?
Yeah, right?
But growing up, I thought, you know, I was like every kid. I was very afraid of something happening to my parents. And I was, you know, as far as I could tell, I had a great relationship based on what I was given.
What were the rules in the home? What were the things you had to do as a kid? And what were the things you weren't supposed to do as a kid?
Oh, man.
I don't know if you want to list that long as to things they weren't supposed to do.
Let's just tell you what I was allowed to do and leave. No, the list of what we weren't allowed to do was a little longer. But what we were allowed to do was, we had homeschool. So that was something that we had. It wasn't something that was put as a top priority, but it was there for us as young children growing up, homeschooling. And but it was just mostly with family. You know, we didn't really have a whole lot of other extended family or friends that were involved in that. We were allowed to go out and work at a very young age, which, because that's what all my older brothers were doing, that's kind of what I wanted to do. That seemed to be the priority, and kind of what everyone aspired to do was to just get out and work. So that's what I wanted to do.
As a very young age.
Yeah, I grew up. I grew tall very quickly, and so I came off as an 18-year-old when I was about 14 or 13. So I was able to get out there on these job sites pretty early on.
What job sites?
Construction
job sites.
Okay, talk about construction culture in FLDS families and communities.
It was the number one thing that we knew how to do, and the number one thing, it was our moneymaker, I guess you could say. Most everyone, if you didn't have some type of job within the community, like my father, the mayor, then you were typically in construction of some kind or another. So I jumped around a little bit. I did framing, I did masonry work, I did flooring, and I did, several different things throughout my upbringing.
Would this have been for other FLDS families or for just normal non-FLDS clientele?
Oh, no. It was I was only ever allowed to work for people that were FLDS.
Well,
right, but I mean on homes that who would move into?
Oh, I see. No. We worked outside of the community. That was kind of how we made the money, was to go out in several states, actually, and we would do construction for homes in St. George and in Nevada and in Arizona and Colorado. So we kind of traveled around and built homes for just I guess you could call it Gentiles.
But they were only allowed to work for like other FLDS members. So like the FLDS were known for having a lot of construction companies, right? So his brothers would have a stoneworking company, and you'd have an uncle that had this company and that company. And these young boys would stop schooling at the age of 12 to 14 and go start working full time for whatever family member or other member of the FLDS, and go out on these construction job sites for anybody. But they were known, like I grew up in St. George, it was about 45 minutes away from Hilldale. And in St. George, like you wanted the polygamous workers on your job site because you knew they did an amazing job. They worked hard, they worked fast, they had big crews of people. So they were known for their craftsmanship and for doing a really good job in construction. So they always had a ton of work in my community. But we didn't know necessarily that it was all like a lot of child labor.
So who owned the companies? Did the FLDS Church own the construction companies, or were they privately owned, or was it a mix?
It was a mix. It started out that they were privately owned. And then as time went on, it seemed like the church wanted more control over some of the companies. So then it became a mix. And then during Warren's heydays, he kind of took over, and just everything kind of belonged to him, and all the money belonged to him. And but there were a lot of companies that were privately owned by FLDS members, and they would just turn in a lot of their money as tithing to the church, but they were in control of the company. That was my childhood. When I was growing up, going to work, they were privately owned, but then just giving a lot of their money to the church that they owned, or the profits of the company.
I have more questions, but Jen has a question. Sure.
I was just wondering, so at 14, you're on the job site. Did you get a paycheck? Or how did that work as far as like paying the younger people that were working?
Yes, great question. And I did get a paycheck. And it was one of those things where it was very clearly known to us that when we get this paycheck, a certain amount of it needed to go to Father to help take care of the family. So that was, some people ask us, how in the world was your father able to provide for such a large family? Well, there you have it. A lot of us out there working would give money to him to help provide for the family. Mm-hmm. So a lot of our money would go to, I guess you could say in a roundabout way, to the family or to the church. But we were able to keep some of it, and that's why a lot of the men you'll see out there have the really nice vehicles and things like that, because they were able to spend some money on what they wanted.
So do you know what kind of wage you were paid as a child and as a teenager, like hourly wage, and then what percentage you had to give to your dad? remember?
Boy, oh boy. It was I don't. A lot of it was piecework. So you get paid a certain amount per. Like for example, when I was doing masonry work, putting rock work on people's homes, we got paid a certain amount per the square foot that we did. So if you worked extra hard, then you would get paid more. And I'm trying to remember the rule with as far as giving money to the family or to father. I believe it was a dollar amount that we were expected to give him. So if we worked harder and made more money, then we could keep more money because he expected us to give a certain dollar amount. And I forget exactly what that dollar amount was. I apologize.
That's fine. And there are child labor laws preventing the exploitation of children. Like, was it legal for you to be working at such young ages, or was it illegal?
It was illegal.
It was illegal.
And I actually was prepared that if anyone came to me and asked me how old I was on the job site, I was prepared to tell them I was 18.
So you were told to lie?
I don't remember if I was straight up told to do that or if I just knew that it was illegal, so I was going to do it myself just because I knew that it could get myself and the employer in trouble. So I don't remember anyone specifically coming to me and say, hey, you need to lie about your age. Maybe, but I just remember that I was ready to say that.
And you started working on these construction jobs around what age?
Around 14.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And did they just pay you in cash?
Yeah. Yes and no. Sometimes also checks.
Because checks are traceable. Cash is not traceable.
Right.
Yeah.
So the companies that would pay me with checks, they were paying they were paying taxes. They would have had to been.
So maybe that was when you were older and it wasn't illegal for you to be working.
Right.
Maybe they would pay the 14-year-olds in cash, and once you became 16, you'd get the check.
I wonder now back because do you know what the labor laws are in Utah?
I'm sure you can
It's
work at 15.
I was going to say, normally it's.
Maybe it's 16.
I mean,
no,
I
16
imagine
in California.
paper
I
boys.
think it's 15 for.
The thing is, I'm sure paper boys can deliver newspapers at younger ages. So
Okay.
I don't even pretend to know what's illegal
yeah,
and
I'm not
what's
sure.
not.
So I was a little bit older when I started getting checks. So I imagine I must have been 15 or 16 years old.
So they would do it cash until it was legal, I'm sure.
Yeah.
They're smart.
Yep.
Okay, and this is probably not going to be surprising to you, but as I think about raising my kids, especially in the era of like cell phones and iPads and video games and screens, as I was growing up as a traditional Mormon dad, I wanted my kids to learn to work.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's like, for me, even after I'd kind of lost my Orthodox faith in Mormonism, the thing that I wanted most is my kids to grow to adulthood and to be able to work hard and provide for themselves. Because like, how else can you get by and have a good, healthy life if you can't make ends meet?
Right.
So I wanted them to be honest, hard workers who could provide for themselves. And it turns out, I think my kids are great. And it was really hard to figure out because just getting them to like I remember Saturdays growing up, like, okay, we're going to work. We're going to go weed the garden. And it was almost like mutiny that ended in people crying. And I'm just like, I can't even get my kids to freaking weed the flower bed in front of our house. Like, how are my kids ever going to learn to work? And so for us, it ended up being where school was the way they worked. But chores around the house were, they'd make their bed maybe if we were lucky or help with the dishes maybe. But getting them to work around the house was hard for us. And so like, I'm thinking of your childhood with a lot of envy as a child and as a parent, in the sense that you just said you were looking forward to work.
Yes, and it was looking forward to work because it was kind of a way to be with the big boys, right? And to get out of the house and get away from some of these chores around the house that we were required to do. And it just, for some reason, the feeling out there was the quicker you can get to work, the better. I don't know where that came from, but it seemed like all of us boys just wanted to do that. And and it was also the only way we were going to be able to make any money. So we wanted to be able to make that money to maybe buy us a new bike or, any of the big purchases. Even though we had money, we were supposed to run them all through Father anyway, just to make sure. Got in trouble for that a few times.
I was just going to say, I'm like, is that what you did, babe? How'd that work out for you?
What type of purchases?
Yeah, what purchase did you make?
Well, one specific, we were preparing for a funeral. And we were all walking out to Father's vehicle to, as a family, drive over to the funeral. And as we were walking out to his car to get in, a big semi-truck pulls in front of our house. And they start unloading this couple really large boxes but putting them on our front porch. And Father looks around, what in the world is going on here? And I'm this little teenager. I'm like, oh, that's me. That's my new bed. He did not appreciate that at all. So we got a Sermon on the Mount about how we need to run every purchase through him after that. But it was just
so he would have been unhappy. Why?
Just because he wanted to know what was being purchased and where our money was going. We didn't want us to be spending money on things that weren't alled.
I thought you were going to say it was like a four-wheeler, like a jet ski or something.
I got in trouble for a big old bed. Yeah, that's all it was.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Which I left behind when I moved out because it was too big.
But for those who want to criticize the lifestyle, we'll just call it the lifestyle, unless you want me to call it something different. Like, there's some real, I'm thinking about, I remember growing up and watching the movie Witness with Harrison Ford, where he's like this crime investigator trying to solve a murder, and he moves into an Amish community. And one of the most beautiful moving scenes I've ever seen in Hollywood is this scene where like someone's, I think, house burns down or barn burns down, and they do a barn raising as a scene where the entire Amish community comes and builds the barn in like a day to help out someone who had lost their barn. It was super moving. And I looked at that and I thought, what a beautiful feeling and idea to have a community that just pitches in together, helps each other, and serves each other. What do you think of or feel when I say that?
No, it's funny you mention that, John, because it happened often. There would be a family in need, a family that didn't have a home, and we would come together, and it was almost this competition. On a Saturday, we would come together as a community and build a house in a day. That was kind of a really cool thing that we were known for, that we could build a house in a day.
You could?
We could. There was a concrete slab there, but that was it. And we built the home. We had every
trade.
Every trade was within the community, so we could all come together and figure out a way to build the house. Exactly.
And you did that?
We did that.
Well, how did that feel?
It felt amazing. As far as, depending on what age I was at a very young age, it was almost overwhelming because I showed up at the project and I didn't have really any idea what I was doing. So I was just kind of running around trying to get out of people's way. As you can imagine, building a home in a day takes a lot of people all in the same space. So it was a little overwhelming, but as you got older and really good at your job, then it was very fulfilling and a very fun thing to do. And then you would see the family move in the next day and you were just like, wow, we did that, right? So it was a very cool feeling.
I helped a friend move the other day and I felt like $1 million when I was done. You know what I mean? Like, I can't imagine what it feels like to help a family in need like that.
Yeah. It was great. And that wasn't the only time that we came together as a community. There were a lot of community events that were held when I was young. Obviously, Warren took all those things away later on, but when I was younger, we had community events where we got together to either do a project or even just have some fun sometimes at the parks. And we would, the Harvest Festival was one thing we did. The 4th of July celebration was another. And we came together as a community. We had a lot of food, a lot of fun, and just played games and had a great time all together. So
was it 4th of July or 24th of July?
Actually, both.
Okay.
We did something on both of those, but the 4th of July was the bigger of the two that we celebrated.
Now, I thought fundamentalists weren't crazy about the government, and so I would have thought they might not celebrate the 4th of July because of the historical persecution but from their perspective of the government, from the government to you all.
Right. And, that was something that is definitely a big factor, but that came after Warren's time. Warren was the one that kind of made us start to hate the government more.
So that stuff about not finishing the house to avoid taxes, was that post-Warren or pre-Warren?
I think it was post-Warren. There may have been some of that happening beforehand. In 2000, were the Olympics in Salt Lake in 2002?
Yeah.
2002. So in 2000 or just before 2000, before the Olympics, all of the members of the FLDS community that lived in Salt Lake City were commanded to leave Salt Lake City because we were told that if the Olympics came here, that would be the earth would be destroyed.
End of times.
End of times, right? One of the end of times. So all of the people that lived in Salt Lake City, which were a lot of FLDS members, moved down to Short Creek.
Was your family here in Salt Lake?
No, we were in Short Creek.
You were.
So we just got to witness the town filling up very, very quickly. And some of these homes, I was under the assumption, I know that you hear about the taxes and trying to skirt around that, and maybe that was something to do with it. But I was under the assumption that a lot of these homes weren't completely finished because we were just popping homes up left and right, trying to fit all of the people moving into homes.
The term that I remember learning about was bleeding the beast. Does that term mean something to you? Did it then, and does it now?
It wasn't something that we were really, or that I was personally involved in.
You don't remember that term?
I don't remember that
up?
term, no.
Do you want to explain to people what is meant by that term?
Well, there came a time where Warren told all of the followers that the government was after us. They were trying to just destroy us completely. And so his commandment was, we do not give them anything. So we do not give them, we do not pay our taxes, we do not do any of these things because we're funding this persecution and they're just all evil and we can't, anyway. So
but my understanding was, but they would take advantage of social services like welfare. And so you're bleeding the beast by taking as much from the government as you can, but not giving back to it.
Yes, and that was another part of it. There was a lot of fraud in the food stamps, for one, they would take advantage of that. And from what I heard, they would go in there and collect food stamps, and then they would just turn around and give it all to the church. So it wasn't even for themselves. And there were a lot of these women that had children with men that weren't legally married. A lot of the men were married to the first wife legally, and then were not married to all of the other wives. So technically, these were single moms with children needing to care for these children.
With 12 children, because they were just celestial marriages that couldn't be on record because of it being illegal to practice polygamy. So
they would go and collect all of their benefits from the government, turn around and just give it straight to the church.
Wow.
So I guess if that's what you're referring to as bleeding the beast, that also did happen.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay. Yeah. And just really quickly, I learned this from the Keep Sweet documentary because I didn't realize this, that Warren, I think it was Warren, not Rulin, when the Olympics came, told everybody that the end, Jesus would be coming soon.
Yes.
So you were in Colorado City, Hilldale, when everybody moved in, but then Jesus didn't come. And that's a modern day example of a modern day prophet's prophecy not coming true. What are your Jen's?
I'm just wondering what he said to you guys, like why he wanted everyone to come down. Like what was the narrative that was being said to you guys? Why everyone was coming down there?
And then how he managed the prophecy ending up not coming true too.
Yeah.
It wasn't even the only time that he said it was going to be the end of the world either. There
were several times. And because of all of these prophecies, I will just say as a child, I was always in a state of fear, right? I was afraid of so many things happening because he was talking about the end of times all the time. And it was just that, hellfire and damnation was his sermon all the time, as far as Warren Jeffs goes. And so we were very afraid of these type of things. But you ask, how did they skirt around the prophecy not coming true? And what did they say about that? It was actually very simple because it was always blamed on the people. If something didn't come to pass, it had nothing to do with the prophecy not being true. It was because we as a people weren't righteous enough. We weren't obedient enough. So it was because of us. It was our fault that Jesus Christ couldn't come back to the earth. We weren't prepared for him.
And they believed that everyone had to come to Hilldale, to the creek, because that one specific town, everything else in the entire world would burn and would be destroyed, and they all needed to be together in one Zion in order to be saved. Yeah,
so to
literally.
Jen's question, exactly, we were told they all had to move down because Short Creek was the only place that was going to be completely safe, and so that was kind of the idea behind it. And they would talk about because Short Creek has large, really tall mountains surrounding it. And they talked about, because of the way the mountains were set up, the bomber planes wouldn't be able to come in and bomb the town. And I mean, it was very much talked about Russia invading on one side and China on the other side, and everyone's going to be after the Lord's people, and we're going to be destroyed unless we're obedient, if we're not obedient. So when things didn't happen like they were prophesied that they would when the Olympics did come, then I was even more afraid. I was like, oh no, now what? Now we're for sure going to be destroyed. And then the next prophecy would come several years later, and then we would try to prepare for that one. And there was always something.
Yeah, and that's a technique that high demand religions or cults use called blame reversal. You always have to blame the members, and it for prophecies that don't come true, and it provides at least two important functions. Number one, it gets the leader off the hook for making a failed prophecy, but it also makes the members more afraid and more perfectionistic and more devoted, which is weird because you would think a failed prophecy would weaken the devotion of the membership, just like a failed treasure dig by Joseph might weaken the devotion of his followers. But the truth is, if you can turn the blame of the failed prophecy or the failed treasure dig back on the people themselves, they're ironically more devoted after the prophecy doesn't come true than they were before.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I agree. That's how I felt. I felt that because it was my fault, I had to be better. I had to try harder because, Christ is trying to come, right? And it's all my fault. It's our fault that he's not here yet. And so it was just it was a constant state of fear and a constant state of, I'm not good enough. What do I do now? And then eventually you get sick of it.
Like I'm feeling deep ambivalence of like almost a romantic envy of the idealized parts of your upbringing, and this I'm sighing deeply at like this shame and the perfectionism and the oppression that you were experiencing. I'm experiencing both emotions, and I didn't even go through it. Jen, were you going to say something?
I'm just saying that I think that still exists in the mainstream LDS church right now. That is very similar, I believe, like the reversal, fear and shame for not being obedient. It's your fault, that things are happening. I think that still exists quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, something similar still.
Like if you don't have kids, maybe you weren't faithful, or if your patriarchal blessing doesn't come true, or if you don't,
Yeah, so much of that still.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah.
It's sad. Yeah.
Anyway,
Absolutely.
I'm envious and really sad about your upbringing simultaneously.
Yeah,
But there's a lot of envy, weirdly.
Right. Yeah. It was interesting, and I don't look back and think, oh, what a horrible childhood, or I don't look at it that way.
Oh.
But I would consider myself one of the lucky ones. I feel that I got out just in time.
Yeah.
Some of the people dealt with a lot more than I did.
This whole last 20 or 30 minutes started with me asking about the rules of your upbringing.
Oh yeah.
And it was a perfect path to go. But just quickly, like in my Mormon home growing up, no swearing, no alcohol, no tobacco, no drugs, no porn, no masturbation, no R movies, obey the Sabbath, don't go shopping on Sunday, modesty stuff. What were the main rules growing up in your home? Just make a big old list if you can.
Yes. So I will gladly do that. But for those that are familiar with the Mormon mission, I will just say, for you, the rules on the mission were not any difficult thing to deal with, because those are very similar to the rules in the FLDS. We weren't allowed to swim. We weren't allowed to really have any type of entertainment. We weren't allowed to watch movies. We weren't allowed to watch
At all.
Or listening to music.
No movies. No. They call it Gentile music. So really, the only music we were allowed to listen to was music made by the church, and
hymns, basically, and primary songs.
and a lot of songs that were created by church members that were either Warren or close to Warren. That would the words were very much, praise the prophet, follow the prophet,
Keep sweet.
He's keep sweet no matter what. He knows the way, nobody else. It almost like turned it away from Christ, more focusing on the prophet.
Can you sing a song or two that you remember that would have been encouraging you to follow the prophet or Warren Jeffs or whatever? Do you even remember? Is that not everyone's into music like me?
If I had a singing voice, that would be the first requirement here. Second requirement would be to memorize all the words, which I don't.
Okay,
I haven't listened to the music for such a long time.
Yeah.
I still do have, like, if a song comes on, like watching some of these shows like Keep Sweet and Obey, I listen to that music that comes on sometimes. It just takes me to a place. I mean, this music was forced on us from every angle. So the music is one of those things that was a very big part of kind of putting our mindset in the right place, I guess you could say.
Or maybe a more sinister interpretation, the music was used to what?
To convince us of certain things or to persuade us to believe a certain way, definitely.
Kind of maybe to control or indoctrinate you a little bit?
Yes, I would definitely say that.
Yeah.
When he hears the music, it definitely brings up like a lot of emotion, and you can see just in his face, like it hit him how much he remembers it. So I think if a soundtrack came on, you would be able, he could sing along with it for sure. I remember when we were dating, being in the car, and I was flipping, you know, back when you had like CD albums in your car, you know, and we're flipping through CDs, and there was a CD with Warren's face on it, and I was like, what is this? And
I have some.
Yeah, and he's like, oh, it's, you know, the music I listen to. So we popped it in for a second. I couldn't handle it for very long because I'm a big, I listen to the words of songs really closely, and there's so much indoctrination in those songs to be loyal to Warren. But yeah, it's definitely, you'd be able to sing along.
I would be able to sing along, but to just think off the top of my head, you know, it's been about 15 years since I just sat down and listened to the songs.
So like, as you think about who it was most important to obey, there's God, there's Jesus, there's Joseph Smith, and there's Warren Jeffs. What would be the order that it was emphasized for you growing up?
Warren Jeffs, and Warren Jeffs.
I didn't. That sounds like I anticipated that answer, but actually I wanted you to rank them.
You know, I mean, they tried to turn it on, hey, all you have to do is follow Warren because he speaks for God, right? So they try to make it seem like ultimately you're following God and Jesus Christ. That's the ultimate, you know, idea here. But all you have to do is listen to and follow Warren, because he won't lead you astray. He will make sure you do that in the perfect way.
He speaks for God.
Yes.
Yeah.
100%. Yes.
You'd probably rank himself right there. Like, rather than it being a ranking, like you'd think a list, it's Heavenly Father and Jesus, and Warren is right there with them, and he's the one that's speaking down. So I'd say it's more of a parallel rather than a ranking.
And his sermons, sometimes he would walk up to the pulpit and just look down. Silence. You could hear a needle drop. He would just sit at the pulpit, not making a sound. And I was always told by my mother that he was praying. And the reason he was praying is because the words that he was about to speak were God's words. He wasn't thinking up what to say. He was praying for God to be, and the Spirit to be with him, to be able to speak his words. Like
speak the words.
God is speaking directly through him at that point. That's what I was taught.
So much power.
He had too much power over the people, for sure.
Did he have to worry about what past prophets had said? Because one of the things that modern LDS prophets have to deal with are really embarrassing, or even just different things that past prophets have said, like gays are bad, or homosexuality's a perversion, or blacks shouldn't have the priesthood. Like, there's always this, like, how do we not undermine ourselves by overriding what past prophets have said while still changing so that we're not viewed as bigots today? Mm-hmm. How did Warren Jeffs deal with previous rules or prophecies or doctrines or teachings of previous prophets?
Well, because he kept things so strict, it was actually very easy for him, because he would keep the same rules. He never changed those rules. He would just add to them. So he never went back and said, oh, now it's okay for the blacks to have priesthood. No, he was still very much against that. If it was in the scriptures, he's against it. He just made more rules on top of the rules that were already there. So it was almost easy for him.
They definitely stayed very fundamental. You know, the gospel had been restored, and how that was in the very beginning with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, that is what they held true to. There was no trying to go back on what Brigham Young said. It was what he said was truth, and we only build on it.
Okay. So just to close this one out, so no TV, no cartoons growing up, not even Disney movies?
Well, okay, so that's a good question because there was a little bit of that allowed. Only if father, not one of the mothers, father himself had to be present in the room, then we could watch very selected movies. I watched Bambi. I watched Winnie the Pooh. I watched The Sound of Music, some National Geographics, and then we watched all those over again 100 times. So that was about it.
Very, very short list.
So,
And it had to be a special occasion too. We couldn't just randomly, hey, father, I want to watch a movie. No. It had to be, okay, it's family. We tried to do a family home evening once a week. Typically on a Monday is when we would do that, if it worked out. And we would all meet together as a family, and we would either play games or on occasion we were able to watch a movie. So it was a very structured, like almost like a treat to be able to watch anything.
how do 30 or 40 people do a family home evening?
Well, there were never quite that many in the home at once because
Okay,
so many.
20.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there were very large rooms. Our family rooms and living rooms were huge.
The
right?
homes
They were very big.
They're like hotels. Even now, I mean, Hilldale, now a lot of them have been converted into hotels. Talking massive, massive homes.
We also would hold certain meetings in our homes for like Sunday meetings. For example, the Sacrament meeting was actually held in our home before going to the general meeting.
Well, explain that.
Yeah, so basically on
Were
Sunday.
there chapels that everyone would attend? Were
yes.
there wards? Were there
So there was only
stakes?
one big church building
Meeting house.
in Short Creek. There was just one big meeting house, and it could fit all the members. So very, very, very large building. Had
How many
two-
members at its peak?
In Short Creek, I think it got up to about 10,000.
That's like a mega church.
Yes.
Yeah.
Lot of chairs.
What was that building called?
The meeting house.
Oh,
I believe it was named after Roy Johnson, so I believe it was called the Roy Johnson Meeting House.
it was folding chairs or like
Yes,
auditorium?
we would set out a lot of chairs. There was also a surrounding balcony on the second floor that would kind of surround the main hall and look down onto the main hall and the speakers at the pulpit. So just a lot of chairs set out, and we would just sit there and listen to the leaders preach. But that was at 2:00 in the afternoon when that meeting was held, from 2 to 4 o'clock. Before that, every Sunday morning, we would hold in our homes what we called Sacrament meeting, and that was where we had the breaking of the bread and the water, and all of that was passed out to just family settings.
That's interesting because during COVID, the church was kind of moving in that direction. And with the church's new curriculum, I've been out, so I don't remember what it's called, but more home
Come follow
study.
me.
Yeah.
What's that?
Come follow me.
Come follow me. Sorry, that came out after the church kicked me out. But that's the church moving a little bit more in the direction of the fundamentalists.
Seems like it.
If the administration of sacrament and instruction is more home-based primarily.
Yes, and the meetings were they were run by the family or by the head of the family, or otherwise known as the father, and he would select who would say the prayers, who would which songs would be sung at these meetings, and a couple of the older boys that held the priesthood would come up in front of the room and kneel down and say the sacrament prayer, break the bread, pass out the water. Something interesting about the passing out of the water, though, is we just all use the same cup. So instead of having individual water cups, we would all take a sip out of the same water cup. So they're a little bit different than the way the church, the LDS church, does it today. But
Now, the Book of Mormon originally had wine instead of water, so I'm wondering how fundamentalists dealt with that.
they just we weren't supposed to. They had the word of wisdom.
No, I mean wine as part of the sacrament.
Right. I don't know. They didn't really give a whole lot of instruction on why, and that's something they were able to get away with. They didn't have to give the answers to why exactly. They just were able to say this is the way it is because this is what God wants. Period. And we said okay.
Because I think the earliest Book of Commandments / Doctrine and Covenants would have also said wine instead of water, and that would have been changed at some point.
Yes, I would have to have a conversation with my father or someone that was earlier on in the church to understand why exactly they weren't allowed to, or we weren't allowed to have wine. But I assume it's something similar to the reason the mainstream LDS church doesn't allow it now.
Yeah.
In fact, maybe it changed before they split off.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe that's why.
Okay. So it's home church with just your father, his wives, and all the children. Did multiple families ever do home church together?
There were times where we would have, for example, my grandmother, father's mother, we would go pick her up and bring her to be there. So there were some times where some extended family would join in as well, but it was mostly just a family meeting. Okay,
and so there was prayer, hymns, sacrament, and what else? During home church, basically?
And then sermons. Yes, and then we also had, within that same meeting, after we had the sacrament and the hymns and all of that, there would be a sermon or two, and then we would split off to what we called Sunday school. And that was based on the age groups. So depending on how old you were, there were different classes that we just met in different rooms in our home. And then the older siblings would teach those classes based on our age.
Or the sister wives? Teach?
Or one of the mothers, yes. Or one of the mothers or one of the older siblings.
Sorry, yeah.
And I believe that father would typically be in charge of and teach the priesthood classes, like the Melchizedek priesthood classes.
Did you have a Relief Society equivalent for women?
Oh, boy. Not that I can think of. Maybe we did. Maybe I just didn't pay attention because I wasn't a part of it.
The women had class. I don't know if it was on Sunday, but they did have very specific classes where the women went and had trainings.
They had trainings, so I guess they could have called that Relief Society.
Yeah, whether you want to call it, or whether they called it a Relief Society or not, they had specific trainings, and they had manuals and things of how to be a righteous mother in Zion, and just normal motherly duties and duties as a daughter, and all those type of things. Very specific. My one sister-in-law has given me those manuals, so I've gone through on some of our videos and sharing some of those, which are really interesting. But I don't know if they ever called it Relief Society, but
I think I watched one of your podcasts and one of the ladies called it homemaking.
Oh yeah, homemaking class. You're right.
Is that right?
That does sound familiar.
That
okay.
Sounds, yeah.
Yeah.
Nice, Jen.
Look at you knowing your stuff.
You're remembering our episodes better than I am, so that's awesome.
But at home church, there was the equivalent of sacrament meeting. There was the equivalent of priesthood meeting. There's the equivalent of Sunday school. I guess you didn't call the kids' education primary.
Primary does actually ring a bell. I'm trying to separate what I've learned and heard in the mainstream LDS church from what I was raised with.
Yeah.
But primary did ring a bell, but I believe it was only because of the primary songs that we had and would sing.
Got it.
Now that I think about it, I believe it was only because of the primary songs that that name rings a bell from my childhood.
Okay. And the fact that the women wouldn't have their own meeting during church maybe fits the pattern of how patriarchy can sometimes play out. So I'm not super surprised at that. In terms of the scriptures that you viewed as scripture, what books did you view as scripture? And how is that different or the same from the LDS church?
Yes, so very similar actually. They had the Book of Mormon, the Bible, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, and a lot of the Joseph Smith's teachings, Brigham Young's teachings, and then they would have also some scriptures that they would refer to as scriptures from more modern prophets as well, like even Warren Jeffs would have some scriptures, I guess you could say, and other leaders of the church. But
were they added to your So did your Doctrine and Covenants go beyond what our Doctrine and Covenants went to?
No, actually, my father would go and buy scriptures from Deseret Book. So had the exact same ones.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say exactly what you were going to. So go ahead.
Okay. No, I was just going to say the only thing that was never really changed is they would always stick with the brown hymn book. They never switched over to the green hymn book.
So you used the LDS Church hymn book that was used prior to the green one.
Correct.
Yep.
So you would sing all the same hymns I grew up singing, basically.
Yep. Exactly.
Wow.
And get the same scriptures, quads, straight from Desert Books.
Yeah, we had quads. We had the same exact scriptures.
So Book of Abraham, Book of Moses.
Uh-huh.
So you sang, you sang "Come Follow Me." You sang, "I Stand All Amazed."
All of those.
"Oh How Lovely Was the Morning."
Oh, yes.
Those are all hymns of your.
We
Put your
sang-
shoulder to the wheel.
Yep. All of those. I sang all of those. There were some changes made when they switched over to the green hymn book, but most of the hymns are the same.
Wow.
Yeah.
What about primary songs?
See, we did have a primary hymn book as well, and so I did grow up from being familiar with a lot of the primary songs.
The same ones I would have been familiar
Yeah,
with?
like "I Am a Child of God," "Jesus is a
Wants Me for a
wants me
Sunbeam.
for a sunbeam." Those type of songs.
You would have learned and sang those.
Yes.
Did you sing Follow the Prophet?
I think that would have come later.
I don't think.
Is it?
I think
Also, it would have come after the green book had been
okay.
released.
Yes, that one
Okay.
does not sound familiar
Okay.
from my childhood. I've heard it now.
I was just wondering if Warren would like that song. So I was just wondering.
I know.
Yeah.
You think it would be right up his alley.
He came up with songs very similar to that.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So, where were the revelations given by FLDS prophets kept if they weren't added to the Doctrine and Covenants?
They had their own separate books.
What were those books called?
Oh my goodness. That I don't remember. I never read them. I just knew we had them around the house. As a young teenage boy, I wasn't really that into reading sermons. So I only read what I had to read, basically, as far as that goes. But I don't remember any of the names, to be honest.
That's fine.
And
That's
I think they would be similar to like some of the books that the apostles of the LDS Church have come out with. Some of these apostles have written books. It would be something like that, but we would consider it scripture.
Yeah, or like the teachings of Harold B. Lee or whatever, when you have like the teachings and then that's what you study from in Sunday school in the LDS. It's similar to that. We have some of his that he had written since he was in prison.
Yes.
And it will just say like revelation to all nations, a revelation to the United States government. And it'll still be like that thick, but it's a whole series of revelations. And then they'll get that series of revelations bound. And then that's one book of revelations from him.
Okay.
Is the Revelations, I think I've seen a picture of one. So is the Revelations always written in like verses like the scripture?
Yes.
Yes.
In King James English?
Yeah, I mean,
Sort of, yes,
very
actually.
close.
Very
Close.
similar.
I'd say it's very similar to the Doctrine and Covenants. Honestly, like,
Apparently, God and Jesus only speak King James English, apparently.
yeah, they change
It's
other things as the
interesting,
times change. A lot of other things change, but the way they speak always stays the same.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, it's a valid point. That does seem to be, thee, thou, seems to always carry on through Scripture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and I know we're going back to this again, but I just, you comparing it to a Mormon mission experience is really interesting because, a lot of people don't like the modern LDS Church being referred to as a cult. They find it deeply offensive. But I think it's fair to say that the LDS missionary experience, at least the experience that I had growing up, was the most cult-like, approaches the most cult-like living conditions in the LDS Church, because you can't be alone, literally, except when you're going to the bathroom. You couldn't call home but twice a year. Like, you couldn't even go home if a parent died. Like, you couldn't call home. You couldn't read the newspaper, couldn't watch the news, couldn't read books that weren't church books. You had like 5 books you could read, couldn't listen to popular music, only church hymns. Like, by any standard, couldn't date. Like, by any standard, that would be viewed as cult-like. Mm-hmm. And you're saying that was your regular life.
Exactly. That, and then maybe some extra rules on top of it.
Like, what else?
Like,
else?
well, every home had their own rules. In my home, we were not allowed to snack. If we were hungry, we couldn't just go up to a cupboard and get some food and eat it on our own. You're right. We'd have to get permission from a parent.
And
I
no
think
pork.
I think a lot of that was due to the fact there were so many of us that if we snacked when we wanted to, that food would not be there for very long. But we weren't allowed to run in the home. That was a huge no-no. Oh boy. There were very, very strict times for meals. Meal times were very, very strict, and we had to be there. It wasn't an option. Every morning we would wake up around 5 a.m. We would meet for morning prayer and scripture reading. And same thing in the evening, about 6 p.m. we would meet for the evening prayer and scripture.
Everyone?
Everyone
So
that was still
family
living in
prayer
the home.
and family scripture reading was everyone.
Everyone, yep.
Okay.
Yes. So, and it was just up to us to make sure we were there. And that was one of the things we were able to get away from a little bit when we started working away from the home, because we would get back from the job sites later, and we would leave so early that we had that little bit more of freedom from not having to be at all these meetings because we were out working. So, and then as far as that was just more family rules. As far as other community rules, we weren't even allowed to think about another girl, let alone
The big one.
let alone try to date. I got in huge trouble once for holding a girl's hand. And
At what age?
I would have been, 13, 14 maybe. And then sometimes we would sneak out of our homes at night just to go and just sit there and talk to a girl, right? Because at a certain age, you're curious and you're interested in, for me, I was interested in girls and I wanted to learn more about them. And I just felt, I don't know. I mean, it was just an exciting thing to be able to go and talk to a girl that was outside of my family. And it wasn't allowed, so it was kind of a rush to be able to sneak out of your home, jump on your pedal bike, and cruise across town to meet behind an animal pen or something, to sit there and kind of hide from everyone and talk. So anyway, dating was a big no-no. We weren't allowed to listen to any music that wasn't made by the church. No entertainment as far as movies and all of that, unless it was very well structured.
What about outside news sources like the Salt Lake Tribune, the Deseret News, like Fox News, CNN?
Yeah. So we would receive a newspaper. That was something that my father would read. And I think it was more important for him to stay up on the news because of his position within the community. And so I don't believe all of the families would read the newspaper, but he did. And if there was something really important, for example, when the Twin Towers were hit, we heard about that pretty quickly. So things that were very, very big news, we did hear about.
But you would not have been able to see the news.
Oh, no. We didn't watch the news. We just heard about it.
Wow. Okay. And so no sources. What about internet use? Phones, cell phones, and smartphones and social media?
Yes. So smartphones weren't a thing when I was out there yet. So as far as having the internet on your phone, there wasn't really a need for it or even a want for it when I was out there. That happened right after I moved out. But we did have cell phones, and we had to basically beg for one, and we had to buy it ourselves if we wanted it. And we had to come up with a very good reason why we needed it. For me, it was, well, I'm going to be working and I need to get a hold of other people for work and all of that. So that's another reason we like to go to work, is because then we would have an excuse to get some of these things. And so I had a cell phone at age 16 was when I was able to finally go buy one myself. And internet was not allowed unless it was for business company use. And you weren't allowed to have that in your home. It had to be at the office. So internet was a huge no-no. And for those families that did have a company that required internet, it was very much monitored, and people weren't allowed to just jump on and do whatever they wanted. So
you didn't have a computer in your home connected to the internet that anyone could jump on?
No, we did not. We had some computers at the building we went to for homeschooling, but it didn't have the internet. It was just used to kind of help us learn how to type.
What about making friends with non-FLDS church members? Why are you laughing?
He wasn't even allowed to make friends with other FLDS children.
Right.
We were not allowed to play with children outside of the family.
What the?
Every family was very much their own family. We weren't supposed to, like the neighbor kids across the street, we weren't supposed to spend any time with them. And
Why?
well, I believe that every family had their own way of interpreting the sermons and the laws and the rules. So they didn't want another family to come in and be a bad example or a bad influence on us. So yes, as far as even within the community, we weren't supposed to make friends, let alone outside of the community. I looked at everyone that was outside of the community as an evil person. I wouldn't have wanted to try to make
Evil?
friends. Yeah,
Yes.
oh yes.
The rest of the world was evil?
Yes.
Well, they were wearing short sleeve shirts. What do you expect? Yeah, that's the way it was, really. I would see someone that wasn't dressed like us, and I would automatically think of them as a bad person in some way or another. As I got older, my ideas started to change because I would work outside of the community a lot more, and that would allow me to spend time with these people and actually realize, oh, wait a minute, these are not all bad people. But I don't know that I was taught that they're all wicked. I'm saying that. It's just the way I thought because of the way I was raised.
I can see how not allowing families to have much interfamily communication, is that intra or interfamily communication? I imagine that would serve a really important purpose for Warren or the church leadership, because it would really cut down on the dissemination of information,
Right.
Oh, yeah.
and gossiping or dissension if families couldn't talk to each other.
Absolutely. I think too, like a lot of people may not fully understand, when they see the things that Warren did and they're like, how can anybody follow Warren Jeffs with all the things that he did? And it's the amount of information they even had of what was actually happening with Warren behind closed doors. Most of the families had no clue. There was no way for them to even get the information of the the things that he was doing behind closed doors. Most people had no idea.
Right. Even now, I will watch some of these documentaries that have come out, and there's things that I see on these documentaries that I'm just like, wait, he was doing what? Right. So I knew that he was, forcing some men to marry younger girls and that type of thing. But I assumed that was a call from God, and it was directly from him to do that. But I had no idea about the other things that Warren himself was doing.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when you went to like the big functions that you talk about, where like more families came,
Parties
were they still? You were still separated, even though you were at this big party,
Picnics
kind of with
or
everybody, or was that the
festivals or-
one day where like you can go see another kid?
Yeah.
Well, there were some moments when we got older that we would have to make friends because we were out working with other people. And like you say, these big functions, we were allowed to, I guess, play with other families and have a good time while we were there, communicate, that type of thing. But we weren't allowed to go home with them and spend some time or have a sleepover or anything like that. It was just a very temporary, hey, how's it going? And maybe play some games together. But it wasn't like becoming best friends.
Like it wasn't like a typical childhood at all. And a lot of those big events, Warren got rid of them.
True.
So those happened early on, but then by the time Sam was like a teenager, those were no longer allowed either. So those opportunities to be able to mix and mingle as a community, as things kind of got more secretive and more bad things were happening, they weren't allowing that anyway.
Yep.
So that, not having the time to communicate between families was definitely part of the control.
Yeah.
Warren banned fun, even the word.
Yeah, you couldn't say fun.
Fun was no longer allowed. If you wanted to say something was fun, you had to say it was enjoyable. Nothing, and everything that was pleasure or fun was not allowed. And he basically told us that we shouldn't be having fun. We are only here to do the work of the Lord, and we need to focus on that. We don't need to focus on what pleases us. Later, we find out some of the things he was doing on the run, and it just makes me want to cringe. But he was telling us that those having any type of enjoyment outside of just the pleasure of serving the Lord and doing his work was not allowed.
So, but you said you played games for family home evening.
Yes. See, that was before, though.
Okay, got it.
Yes.
And then I was going to ask about like friends you'd make at school, but you're homeschooled, so
homeschooled.
You can't even make friends at school.
Exactly.
That is so isolating. I thought it would have been this tight knit community where everyone knew each other and played with each other and made friends within the community. Is that what you're thinking, Jen?
Yeah, I've always thought that way.
And
Yeah.
it was
was
that
at one time.
It was at one time.
Yeah.
It was that way. And when I was growing up, it was that way in the sense that if we needed something or if a family was in need, we would all come together to provide and help. But it wasn't in the way that we all had a very close relationship with each other. That wasn't the case when I was growing up. Before my time, things were a lot more that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it only continued to get more and more strict. Even after Sam left, it continued
boy.
to be more and more isolating. And the things that happened with his siblings after he left was the way they started splitting up the families and putting up walls through the middle of homes and saying, you're worthy and you're not, so you live on this side and you live on that side. They continued to isolate more and more and more.
Yeah. This was starting to happen. It didn't happen to my family while I was there, but families were just ripped apart. As you can see in these documentaries, it's unfortunate.
We'll get there for sure. I was trying to, even the pre-war stuff is crazy. So, but sad, but inspiring. It's a lot of things, but interestingly, coffee wasn't forbidden. Correct?
So, yes, we had the word of wisdom, but we took it as a suggestion, not a commandment.
Because
that's the way it says in the scriptures. It says in Doctrine and Covenants that it's meant to be a suggestion or a recommendation.
Yeah.
And so my father would tell us, well, it is just a recommendation, but if the Lord recommends something, I would recommend that you do it. But that wasn't, but the feel for it, even throughout the community, in our family, Father would have appreciated it if we did not drink coffee, but throughout the community, most people did. And because of that, so did I growing up. When we were on our way to work, we'd stop at a station or something and get a cup of coffee. And so I did grow up in my teenage years drinking coffee. And other things in the word of wisdom as well. Some of them people would follow, some of them wouldn't. It just depended on which one and which family, actually.
So, like, what about tea, tobacco, beer? What about mild drinks of barley? Because Mormons don't know this. The word of wisdom allows beer.
Oh, yeah.
And it allows wine. And the only thing it guards against is hard liquor. And Joseph Smith engaged in all those things, including hard liquor and tobacco.
Absolutely.
So what about beer and wine?
That was fine. That's a short answer. It was fine. Depending on the family. Once again, my father would not allow it, but you would see the leaders of the church, other leaders of the church all the time drinking beer or wine.
I'm stunned.
Yeah.
Are you stunned, Jen?
Yeah. I don't think
I still haven't tried beer
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah.
or wine or any alcohol.
I have not tried beer, but I have tried other alcohol.
Okay.
But yeah, there's so many things that I'm learning for the first time today that we're just not
Yeah.
Good. Well,
we don't know about, we have our own idea about
Child garments,
how
right?
it was.
Child garments, right?
Yeah. I
I didn't know about the rolling
that.
up the sleeves, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah.
But beer's
Yeah.
okay and wine's okay.
Yeah. I didn't know that either.
Yeah. So interesting.
Yeah. I didn't know you couldn't play with other people's families'
Isolation.
kids.
Yeah.
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 There's lots of things.
And one of the reasons I would say that one of the big reasons that the leaders didn't want us to mingle with other families is, let's say we were over at the neighbor's place playing with one of our neighbors and one of their daughters walks out, as a teenage boy, and we start liking them or having feelings towards a girl, that could lead to big problems. So I'm assuming that was one of the big reasons that they didn't want us mingling as well.
when all the marriages are arranged, they really, even within families, they weren't allowed to mingle as much with the sisters. And some of his sisters that I'm close to now have said, they just wanted to get to go play with the boys. And they were always stuck doing chores. And there's so much separation between, even within the family. But outside the family, it was a huge fear, I think, for the leaders, and especially Warren. Once Warren was in power, it was a big fear of his that anybody would try to find a way to have a relationship without him okaying it and him giving the direction. Because in the early days, his older brother, they could request. Earlier prophets, they could request. If they started to like someone from across the room, and they could say, "Oh, is there any chance that we could get married?" And he had an older brother that him and his wife kind of picked each other. They went to the prophet and asked permission, and then they were granted that. And,
Rulon.
This was Rulon, yes.
yeah. And he's still
Not Warren.
Not Warren.
I don't know if Warren ever would have approved that, and depending on the woman you were asking about, if he thought she was beautiful, he probably would have said denied, and took her on as a wife himself. That type of thing happened.
But
unfortunately.
Yeah, but with Warren, as it got more strict, then the fear and the possibility of them seeing other teenage girls or having any type of feelings was threatening to him.
Yeah, I don't personally know of any man that went and asked Warren for that type of thing, because I assume they would have already known that the answer was no, because we were told, or at least Warren told us, that only God could tell us who we should marry.
So because porn and masturbation are such a prominent issue within mainstream Mormonism, I as a way of shame and control, I'm curious if those were even topics of discussion for you growing up.
So because everything, sex talk, everything was so taboo, so off limits, we couldn't even think about it. It wasn't talked about. I don't remember, and maybe other families talked about it more. In my family, I don't remember ever being told or talked about masturbation or porn. There was one time that the porn was brought up, that it was not okay. In fact, one of the leaders of the church randomly called our home and told Father to round up all of us boys within a certain age group, I believe it was all teenagers, and to come to the office and to talk to him. And so one of the leaders of the church was on the other line of the phone. I don't remember if I think it was one of the counselors to Warren. And he said, and he went through this list, we have received revelation that some of your boys have been doing things they shouldn't do, as a way to obviously try to prove that they're receiving revelation. And they said, have you been watching movies? And, and then we'd have to answer that. Have you seen porn was one of the questions. No joke. I turned to Father and I said, what is that? Like, I didn't even know what the word meant.
At what age?
I would have been early teens.
Okay.
I didn't know what the word meant.
Yeah.
And then obviously another question was, have you had any relationship with the opposite sex? And so anyway, those were some questions. So that was the first time that I ever heard about porn. So it wasn't talked about in our family because we just weren't even supposed to know what it was, let alone do it.
And to be clear, this would have been 2003. We're not talking like the 1980s.
Exactly.
We're talking about 2003.
Yes.
The internet was in full swing.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
If you had access to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I'm trying to think if there's any other behavioral rules. Swearing obviously was bad.
Swearing was bad, but as construction workers, it happened. We would swear. But we tried to minimize, to what swear words we would use. And around the home, of course, that wasn't allowed at all. No swearing at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
And saying the Lord's name in vain was super bad.
Yes. Big no.
What about was there ever talk of like, man, we believe in Warren, but like, or Rulon, but like this one thing they did made me sad, or like critiquing and or speaking ill of the Lord's anointed?
Mm-hmm. It was something that if you had those type of feelings, you just kept it to yourself. And the reason for that is, as we have seen in some of these documentaries, Warren could just take you away from your family. So you don't want to talk against him. You don't want to say anything about him that you don't agree with, because he could just take your family right away from you. And so there wasn't really much going around the community of people saying anything because they were afraid it would get back to him.
So no criticism.
Right. We weren't really allowed.
Did the adults vote in U.S. elections, local, state, or federal elections?
The only thing that I remember was local. And so as far as I'm aware, the state and federal, I don't believe so. Not that I'm aware of. Once again, I moved out when I was 18 years old, the month I turned 18. So even if it was available to people, I wouldn't have done it myself, but I don't believe so. I never saw anyone aside from the local, voting for who's going to be the mayor of the cities, right? Those type of things were there, and there were voting booths and all of that.
What about police and law enforcement and the judicial system, like being subject to judges, county judges, and county police and those sorts of things?
Yes. Well, all of that was local as well. Every policeman that I know of was also FLDS. So it was all the law enforcement in that town was within the church. And I believe the leaders of the church would decide who was going to be the police officers, as obviously people they could trust, right? And who was going to be, I don't remember if there was a judge out there or not. I don't know for sure.
Yeah, so like I'm just trying to imagine an FLDS mom, child abuse, abuse in the home. How could she have gotten any support from law enforcement or from a judicial system if there was physical abuse, sexual abuse, even murder?
Yeah, so they didn't go to any law enforcement. So if there was any problems in the home, then they would go straight to the prophet, and they would try their hardest. We know somebody who there is horrible abuse going on in the home, and her mother consistently would just write over and over and over to the prophet. And it took about 3 or 4 months of pretty much you had to be determined to bug them. You had to be willing to have your family taken away in case he just decided he wasn't happy with the fact that you were bothering him over it. It was a huge sacrifice and a huge risk to put your family in that situation. But sometimes the dangers were too big to not do that as a mother. And they would just fight and fight and fight and try to ask the prophet. But there was no going to the police over abuse or anything like that. It was begging the prophet to be put into a different family.
Yeah.
So it was very, very, very sad when it came to abuse. And Sam was so lucky.
I was.
That he wasn't in a family that had to endure that.
Yes, I was very lucky to not have to deal with a lot of the things that other people did deal with. The women weren't really allowed to speak up. They weren't supposed to at all. They could get in big trouble for going to the prophet about something their husband did because they were just supposed to obey their husband.
Yeah, in one of the revelations from Warren that we had been reading and going over, it says specifically that as a wife, if your husband does something that's not honoring his priesthood, it is your job to not correct him, but to support him and try to help him find his way back. And so there was this huge pressure that, like, if you told on your husband, that wasn't good because that makes your husband look bad. Mm-hmm. And if he's doing bad things and you're not supporting, basically it was just always on the woman's head. If your husband does something, you need to be supporting him better because he's just a man and you need to help him with his priesthood. And there's really no place for a woman to go and be fully listened to and to be protected, honestly. There really wasn't.
Wow. Okay. Oh my gosh, a gazillion questions. So you believed in the prophets through which one? Like in terms of LDS prophets?
Through Brigham Young, John Taylor. Through John Taylor.
Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, John Taylor.
Yes.
So the first 3 prophets were still prophets to you.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then after that, it was a whole different line from the mainstream LDS church. Because after John Taylor, it's Wilford Woodruff. And so for us, it was John Taylor and then John Woolley.
What did you guys think of Wilford Woodruff?
There was a little bit of a sour taste in our mouth. He was the one that kind of said, okay, we're no longer going to live polygamy. So there was definitely some bad feelings towards him.
But John Taylor was okay?
He was great, yeah. No problem there.
And then Jesus as the Savior and the basic Christian teachings of Jesus and the atonement and the resurrection.
Yes, all of that was the same as far as I can tell. We read the same Bible, the King James Version. And so all of those stories were very much talked about and not as much focused on as the mainstream LDS church because it was more, hey, this is what Christ taught, but now we follow this man that makes sure that we continue to do what he wants us to do in our day and age.
Do you remember scriptures? Like, I always struggle with the idea, like even when I was a believing Orthodox Mormon, I'm in high school and I'm looking at how many non-Mormons there are in the world. And I divide the number of Mormons by the number of non-Mormons, and I get less than 0.5%.
Yeah.
I'm like, those numbers are kind of a problem. If God's all loving and all powerful, you had a worse problem, because the number of FLDS people in the world by the total number of people in the world is like a super decimal. Yes. You know what I mean? So like, there's the restoration that Joseph Smith supposedly did, which was to end the apostasy and then bring the true new church back to the earth. Well, the numbers there are problematic enough. Well, you had to deal with the restoration falling into apostasy and then being restored again through some super obscure branch. How was that thought about and justified? Why did the restoration go into apostasy and need another restoration? Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, it makes sense.
It definitely does. But they used, the leaders of the FLDS church would actually use that to their advantage. They would say that in the scriptures it talks about how the righteous are going to be very, very few in number, and that only the very elect will make it to the very end and prove to be righteous to the very end. So they would use that as, hey, because we are so small in number, it's proof that it's true, because that's what it says in the scriptures, that there's not going to be very many that are righteous enough to make it to the very end. So they would use that to their advantage, and they would also talk about, well, why would God send so many people to the earth if they aren't going to have the opportunity to learn about him? Why would he do that if he's a loving father, like you say? And so what they would say is, when Christ returns, the millennium will start. During these 1,000 years of peace, after Christ has returned, that's when the preaching will start. That's when temples will start to spread, to be built across the earth. That's where temple work will start to begin. That's when people will start to learn about the fullness of the restoration of Jesus Christ. And so that we were told that as soon as Christ returned, that's when we start teaching the world about it.
Yeah, the LDS, I mean, it's kind of the opposite. Like the LDS, with it being right now, we're supposed to get that going, and then we're kind of tying up loose ends in the millennium, right? And helping the people that weren't able to get it, but we're supposed to be trying to spread as much as possible right now. And the FLDS are like, no, only a small group is really meant to have it on this earth and be able to enjoy it. And then everything is really left to the millennium instead.
Right.
Was there a Aaronic and a Melchizedek priesthood?
Yes, there was.
And what did deacons, teachers, and priests do, or were those offices a thing?
So there were, and we would go to certain meetings that would teach us how we should be as boys and men growing up into the church. So we would go to these meetings on occasion. There was also they were considered missionaries, but they would just go around the community and teach messages from Warren to families and make sure that the families were following certain rules and that type of thing. So these were teachers and priests in the. But
in the modern LDS church, deacons are 12, teachers are 14, priests are 16. Deacons pass the sacrament, teachers prepare the sacrament, priests bless the sacrament.
So there were some different types of responsibilities, not so much for the deacons. That was just more of a, hey, you have the privilege of being a deacon now.
12 years old?
12, yes.
Okay.
So I was ordained a deacon, but I never went beyond that because I was never found worthy enough, I guess you could say. It was a little different. It wasn't, okay, now you're this certain age.
It wasn't automatic.
Right, it wasn't automatic. You had to receive a call from God, I guess, to the prophet that would then say, okay, now he's ready. And so if you were forgotten about, then you're not ready until you're remembered.
Or if you're out there trying to sneak and hold girls' hands, that definitely gets you off the list.
And you're just not a good person, I guess.
So,
so anyway, I did break some rules, on occasion. So maybe that's why. But anyway, so I never advanced from deacon. But I had brothers that did, to teacher and priests. And those were the ones that had the responsibilities of going around town as what they would call missionaries to teach people messages and from Warren Jeffs.
That makes me wonder if Warren ever called missionaries in the LDS church sense of like growing the FLDS church through sending missionaries to the world.
Not that I'm aware of. I believe he
would have been smart to do that.
Right. They didn't seem to focus on trying to get new converts to the church as much as they did just by having lots of children within the church. And I think that's because it was such a secretive organization that they didn't want outside influences to come in and mess things up.
Yeah.
There were some converts, but it was very, very few.
Well, and polygamy is still illegal just about everywhere. And so you go and you start preaching that, you're just putting a big target on your back inevitably anyway.
That's weird because, when Jesus called 12 apostles, it was go out into the world and preach my gospel.
Right.
And then Joseph Smith did the same thing, but that was pre-polygamy and then during polygamy. But you guys had no real meaningful missionary efforts. That's interesting.
No, the only thing that I could say that was kind of along those lines was Warren Jeffs did send sermons out to the world. In fact, when I was in Chile, a sermon from Warren Jeffs showed up to the LDS church, and he was trying to convince people that the end of times was coming. And this was him writing from his prison cell. So,
what about who got called as an elder or a high priest, and what did those offices mean in your church?
Not super familiar with it because I was never involved.
Okay.
I do know that people were called into these callings, and they would have high callings within the church.
Okay.
And they were the ones that would give sermons over the pulpit. But I don't really know, aside from patriarch, because I'm familiar with that, I don't really know what all of their responsibilities were.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And was there a first presidency and a quorum of the 12 or a 70?
70, quorum of the 12, not that I'm aware of.
That's weird.
Yes.
It makes all the sense because you wouldn't want challengers to your authority.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
I believe there were several prophets back, but during the Jeffs era, and that's when I came into the picture, there were counselors to the prophet. So there were two counselors, the prophet. There were bishops. So there was a bishop in the Canadian group. There was a bishop in obviously the Short Creek group, and I believe there was one more group that I'm not sure where it was. So there was a bishop in these different areas, but it was very few leaders that were all the way to the top. And from what I can tell, they were only people that the prophet could trust very, very close to him and to know all the information.
And so the main geographic centers of the FLDS church when you were growing up were where?
The main one was in Short Creek.
Yeah.
After that, there was the one in Canada.
What part?
Oh, my goodness. I was just reading about this.
Like southern Alberta? It doesn't matter.
It's kind of remote, but I don't remember exactly where it is. Someone watching your podcast will know exactly where it was. We have a lot of Canadians that reach out to us on our channel as well and talk about how close in proximity and that they've seen some of these people. So as far as I know, the people that live in Canada now no longer follow Warren Jeffs. They follow Winston Blackmore, and he was the bishop up there during the time of Warren Jeffs before they split off.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So Canada, where else?
Before 2002, Salt Lake City had a big group, but no longer.
Okay.
And then later on, there was a place in Colorado State. There was obviously the big ranch in Texas.
El Dorado.
El Dorado, Texas, exactly.
El Dorado.
And that was a big part of, I was never a part of that. I never went to Texas or Colorado. I guess I was never worthy enough to go to these places, what they called Zion, to help with that. So I look back now, that was a blessing to not have to be involved in all of that. But at the time, I felt like I was just a bad person. I wasn't worthy enough. And so I kind of felt left out. But I'm very, very grateful that I was left out now. So.
At the peak of the FLDS Church's membership, do we have any sense of how many members there were throughout the world?
As far as I'm aware, just over 10,000. As far as I'm aware, there are about 10 to 15,000.
I've heard as high as 20, but I don't know.
And that may be true. Maybe there
With
were
all
more
the different groups.
Maybe there were more in Canada than I was aware of. You know, I never went to Canada. I've never been into Canada, so
Yeah.
I'm unfamiliar with how big that group was. So, but
You were saying to me now, Melissa, right? Melissa,
Yeah.
that there are over 75 different fundamentalist Mormon offshoots with 5,000 or more members. So if you multiply 75 times 5,000, we tried to do the math, but that's something like
a
400,000
lot of people.
Yeah.
fundamentalist polygamist members of offshoots. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what we've been told recently by a good source, I would say. But we were like, wow, we had no idea that there were that many different groups. You know, there's probably the main 5, but there's quite a few in Salt Lake that people are aware of, and then obviously the FLDS. But there's more and more that are continuing to go more fundamental, I guess, from the mainstream church.
What were the main competitors? Because you hear about Centennial Park, and then you hear about the All Red Group, and you hear about other main fundamentalist Mormon groups that aren't the FLDS.
Right.
Yeah.
What are they, and did you even think about them? And if so, what did you think about them?
So I thought they were just apostate groups, people that were led astray and following some corrupt person that they shouldn't be following. That was my impression.
Did you know the names of the groups?
The people I had heard of was the RLDS, the Kingston group, the All Red group, and obviously the Centennial Park group, because they were just a mile away from Short Creek. They're just over the hill. And the Centennial Park group are primarily people that left the FLDS church after Roy Johnson passed away. Because when the Jeffs family took over power, became the prophets, that's when a lot of people said, no, I don't believe in them. This other guy was supposed to be the prophet, and so they followed him.
So it was a pretty recent break off from the FLDS, where a lot of these other ones are a break off from the mainstream LDS. Then you have all these different ones, but the Centennial group is a break off from the FLDS break off.
The FLDS group, yes. And there's been a couple of those.
And I'm guessing if you can't even really socialize with other FLDS families much, you're not having any communication with Centennial Park people.
Oh no, they lived across, like I say, just very, very close. So sometimes they would come into town to our parks and our grocery stores and things like that. But they would start to dress like the outside world. So we looked at them as these bad people that were dressing immodestly and corrupting our town.
Were there ever like fights or battles between the groups that you're aware of?
No, not that I saw personally. It seemed like if we showed up to a park and saw some of the people from Centennial Park there, we would just go our separate ways. We wouldn't want to mingle or be a part of that at all.
Was there any equivalent to anti-Mormon literature within the FLDS group of like books or magazines or newspapers or sources of information that would have been challenging the FLDS church and or the Jeffs that were known to exist, like the Tanners in the Modern Mormon Church, or frankly, like MormonStories in the Modern Mormon Church, or the CES letter? Were there websites, books, pamphlets, magazines, figures, people that were known apostates who were trying to take your church down, you know, that were known?
Yes.
That you were warned to stay away from.
People, yes. There were several people that were brought to our attention of, hey, this person, I know you used to see him in church meetings. He's bad. Stay away from him. He's preaching anti-doctrine. He's this horrible person. Don't listen to anything he has to say. But as far as the actual literature, nothing I knew of. Once again, I didn't have the internet, so there wasn't really that option of really scouring the internet looking for any of this type of thing.
It was more of any literature, like anything. I mean, when the entire internet is against the church, basically, that's kind of what they were told, that's the outside evil world that will just convince you to go do evil things.
That's a good point.
Pretty much all media is considered.
Yes, that's a good point. Even children's books were considered anti-literature because...
What?
I mean, when I was really little, we were allowed to read different books, but as time went on, Warren took away every book that wasn't scripture or written by the church.
He got rid of the public library there, Warren did. So early on, they were allowed to have books. Warren came into power, no more books.
Yeah. So like if you think about like the Tanners or Jeremy Runnels or me, people that would be viewed as enemies of the church, I guess there'd be no consciousness of any enemy to the church because all relationships and sources of information would have been forbidden. So no one could even rise to the level of being viewed as an enemy to the church because they were all just cast out. And the bubble, the control of information and of relationships was so severe.
Right.
And they did such a good job of the fact that when somebody was cast out, like one of his uncles that we have an interview with, he, when he tried to speak up against Warren, and as he left, when they would get up at the pulpit and say, do not listen to so-and-so anymore, he's an apostate. Well, the entire church and all those people were very good at shutting out whoever Warren said to shut out. Yeah. So he could be screaming from the rooftops and all the people would just be like, look away, not listening. Well, there wasn't really a whole lot of platform for him to infiltrate back in to try to convince anybody.
Well, because the second someone was kicked out of the community, all of a sudden, anything he said, anything he did no longer mattered. He was just bad. If he was kicked out, everything he's going to preach from here on out is false, evil. That's just the way it was. So because he was bad enough to get kicked out. So that was the end of him.
And they would get physically kicked out as well from their homes because the homes and the properties were owned by the church. If a man was kicked out, he was no longer even in the community. So it wasn't even something that they weren't a thorn in the side, sticking around and being able to say anything. They were actually physically removed completely from the situation.
Because no one owned their homes. People, well, generally speaking, towards the end, people didn't own their own homes. Mm-hmm. They didn't own their own property. They didn't own their own businesses. Mm-hmm. Their jobs were with members or the church itself.
Exactly.
So the church had
full control.
Full control of everything.
Everything, even families, because they would look at it as even the wives that were given to the men were given to them by the church. So technically, they had this feeling that the church owns my wives, the church owns my children, because everything was given to them.
They would say that the women and the children belonged to the priesthood. So you weren't your husband's, you did not belong to your husband, you belonged to the priesthood. And so the priesthood could do what they wanted with you.
So very, very sad stories about families being torn apart that we can get into, but that was after I moved out.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're almost 3 hours in, and we haven't even gotten to Warren Jeffs yet. We've been talking around it.
Yes.
But I just wanted to paint a picture for your YouTube channel is called Growing Up Polygamy, and I wanted to get a sense of kind of pre-Warren life.
Right.
And I think we've covered a lot of it. What do you think, Jen?
Yeah.
I learned a ton.
I learned a ton too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a good setup. Yeah. It was good to
great questions.
Kind of know how you grew up and what it was like before it kind of maybe went a little wrong. A little wrong.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this first 3 hours.
Of course.
Absolutely.
It's been really beautiful and powerful and shocking and everything. So
thank you. I'm glad to be able to get the story out there. It's something that I'm happy to share.
Okay, so this is part one. We're going to go use the restroom and have lunch. And part two, come right back. Part two is going to be, we're going to talk about how Warren Jeffs really ruined everything. That then is what led to you ultimately leaving the FLDS religion, joining the modern LDS church, serving a mission, meeting your dear wife. And that's going to be what part two is about. And then we'll go from there. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
All right. All right. Well, thanks again. The YouTube channel is Growing Up Polygamy. Thanks again. And Jen, thanks so much for being here.
Of course.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah. We'll see you guys right back. So don't go away. Come right back. And we'll see you all for part two.